Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. A story not of kings or wars, but of bottles and powders. Of cures that promised comfort, yet carried shadows we would only understand centuries later. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. In the soft haze of candlelight, long before the gleam of fluorescent pharmacy aisles and the hum of refrigerated cabinets, there stood the figure of the apothecary. He was a merchant, a craftsman, a healer, and, without ever intending it, a keeper of poisons. His shop smelled of drying herbs, pungent roots, and glass jars stoppered with wax. Behind him, shelves stretched high and precarious, their rows lined with powders, syrups, and tinctures. Each vessel was filled with the promise of relief, and each promise came at a price history would later reveal. The people who stepped into these narrow shops were not thinking of science. They were thinking of aching joints that made walking unbearable, fevers that raged for weeks without breaking, children restless and coughing through the night. They were thinking of mothers weakened by childbirth, fathers exhausted by endless labour, and the elderly who longed only for sleep without pain. The apothecary had something for them all, a drop of this, a pinch of that, stirred into honey or wine, and the sufferer left clutching a vial of hope. It was rarely questioned. Hope rarely is. The promise began with nature itself. The apothecary ground leaves into powder, steeped roots until the water turned dark, boiled resins into sticky syrups. In each preparation there lingered the belief that nature was benevolent, that somewhere in the tangled forest or the dried bundles hanging from the rafters, a cure awaited discovery. And in truth, some remedies did ease suffering. Willow bark soothed fevers, peppermint settled the stomach, valerian coaxed restless minds into slumber. But alongside these harmless comforts came more dangerous concoctions, substances bright and beautiful, substances that glittered in the light and whispered of healing, even as they poisoned the body. To stand in a 17th century apothecary's shop was to see the tension of human history condensed into glass jars. On one side of the counter, desperation. On the other, a man offering certainty where there was none. The air was heavy with scents both sharp and sweet, camphor and clove, lavender and sulphur. And behind it all lay the faint, metallic tang of things better left untouched. The apothecary did not consider himself a deceiver. He had learned his craft through long apprenticeships, memorizing recipes passed down from masters who had themselves relied on books filled with centuries of inherited knowledge. These recipes were written in elegant Latin and often traced back to the ancients. To recite the names of Galen or Dioscorides was to wield authority. And if the ancients had once prescribed mercury to drive out illness, or arsenic to strengthen a faltering constitution, then why should he doubt? Knowledge was inheritance, and inheritance was to be trusted. People came in droves, each one believing that within these bottles lay salvation. A young woman with pale skin and shadows under her eyes might be given a cordial laced with laudanum. It would quiet her nerves, soften her sleeplessness, and grant her a few blissful nights of uninterrupted dreams. A farmer crippled by aches after years of labour could find a tonic of wine blended with powders that gleamed faintly under the light. He would drink, feel the rush of vitality return to his limbs, and for a moment believe himself restored. Children, restless and feverish, were given syrups sweetened with honey, the bitterness hidden by sugar. They would sleep soundly, perhaps too soundly. In this way, the promise expanded. Medicines were not only cures, They were enchantments, drawing whole communities into trust. Mothers whispered to neighbours about miraculous tonics. Merchants carried their own vials across long roads, claiming renewed strength on their journeys. Even the nobility indulged, demanding more elaborate concoctions, gilded bottles, powders imported from distant lands. The apothecary became indispensable. His shop was not simply a store of goods, but a sanctuary, a place where the invisible burdens of the body and soul might for a time be lifted. Yet beneath the candlelight there was a shadow. For each cure there was a consequence. The shimmering powders that promised vigour contained arsenic, slow and relentless in its accumulation. The bright red cinnabar used in ointments was laced with mercury, seeping into the body with every application. The soothing drops of laudanum dulled pain, but quietly bound their users in chains of dependence they could not name. These were not mere accidents of history. They were the natural result of a world in which faith in remedies outran the ability to measure their cost. And still, the apothecary's promise endured. It was easier to believe in healing than to consider the alternative. It was easier to swallow the vial than to face the silence of disease. People did not wish to know what lay within their medicine. They wished only to feel better. And so the poison spread, not with malice, but with trust. The world outside these shops was changing too. Towns grew into cities. Streets filled with the noise of carriages, the cries of sellers, the clang of blacksmiths at their forges. With each passing century, more bodies crowded into narrow spaces. Diseases leapt more easily from one person to the next, and the demand for cures intensified. The apothecary could not keep up with every need, yet he continued to promise. Bottles lined his shelves in neat rows, each carefully labelled, each imbued with the aura of reliability. There was artistry in his work. The bottles were chosen to inspire confidence, thick glass with polished stoppers, painted labels with curling letters. Some were sealed with wax, stamped with ornate designs. The medicines were not simply swallowed or rubbed on the skin, they were consumed as rituals. The patient uncorked the bottle, inhaled the scent, and believed. And belief, as history shows, can heal even when the cure is false. But time would tell a different story. Slowly, people began to notice patterns. A family who swore by arsenic tonics grew pale, weak, and restless. A man who relied on mercurial ointments found his hands trembling, his teeth loosening, his mind clouding into confusion. Mothers who soothed their infants with opiates discovered the children slept too long, their small chests rising and falling with agonizing slowness. Yet in those first centuries, such observations remained whispers, passed quietly from neighbour to neighbour, rarely finding their way into the official record. After all, who would challenge the apothecary, the man whose promise was all that stood between health and despair? The promise of the apothecary was not built on lies, but on the desire to heal. That desire, noble as it was, blinded many to the dangers of the very substances they dispensed. For the line between medicine and poison has always been perilously thin. A few grains too many, and a remedy turned deadly. A few drops too often, and the cure became the cause of suffering. But such boundaries were blurred in the dim light of oil lamps, blurred by trust, blurred by the urgency of pain. As centuries unfolded, these small shops multiplied. In every town square, a narrow wooden door might swing open to reveal shelves of bottles and jars, a man in an apron weighing powders on brass scales. He would smile at the mother clutching her child, nod gravely at the weary labourer, offer measured words of reassurance. The promise was repeated daily, with each customer, with each careful scoop of powder or pour of syrup. And though no one yet realised it, History was slowly filling with stories of remedies that harmed more than they healed. The apothecary's promise was not only a story of individuals, but of societies. Entire communities leaned upon these shops, weaving them into the rhythm of their lives. Illness was part of existence, and the apothecary provided the illusion that it could be softened, delayed, or defeated. He was more than a tradesman. He was a figure of continuity, a symbol of hope in a world where hope was scarce. His promise was that humanity need not bow helplessly to pain and disease, that within glass and powder lay a measure of control. It is from this promise that the deadliest medicines of history were born. Without that initial trust, the shimmering powders and bitter syrups would never have taken root in human lives. The apothecary's shelves were the soil from which the poisonous remedies of later centuries would grow. Laudanum, arsenic tonics, mercurial pills, radium cures, strychnine stimulants. Each would come in turn, wrapped in the same aura of hope. Each accepted because the promise had already been made, centuries before. And so the story begins here, in the narrow shops with low wooden beams, with candlelight flickering on glass, with the quiet rustle of parchment recipes, copied from ancient texts. It begins with the gentle voice of the apothecary, assuring the weary that their suffering might yet be eased. It begins with a promise that would echo across generations, carried forward through time, reshaped, repackaged, but always the same at its core, that within these bottles lies the cure. The apothecary could not have foreseen the centuries of consequences. He did not know that future generations would look back and see these cures as curses. To him, they were remedies drawn from tradition, crafted with care, delivered in good faith. Yet the history of medicine is not the history of certainty. It is the history of trial, error, and error repeated, often at terrible cost. The apothecary's promise, whispered softly beneath the rattle of scales and the creak of wooden shelves, was the beginning of that long, deadly tale. And as the candlelight faded from one century into the next, the promise lingered still, waiting for the age of poisons disguised as medicines to fully unfold. The jars of the apothecary glimmered not only with powders and oils, but with sweetness. Honey, molasses, and sugar became the faithful allies of medicine, disguising the bitterness of roots and the metallic tang of minerals. A spoonful coated the tongue with comfort, soothing the senses before the true substance revealed itself. The apothecary knew well that nothing travelled into the body so easily as sweetness. It was persuasion in its purest form, coaxing the reluctant patient into swallowing what they might otherwise resist. In a time when even bread could taste of grit and water, carried the sourness of wells, sweetness was a luxury. To find it married with the promise of healing was to find heaven itself sealed in a glass vial. Mothers carried home syrup bottles, their wax tops gleaming, confident that the sweetness within would calm a fevered child or hush a stubborn cough. The flavour lulled, reassured and convinced, but beneath that velvet taste often hid a far crueler truth. Consider the syrup bottle set upon the apothecary's counter, its liquid amber swirled with the sheen of honey and a faint aroma of herbs. A mother dipped a spoon, stirred it into her child's mouth, and watched the small body relax. The coughing ceased, the fevered crying dwindled into silence, and at last there was rest. Yet few knew that in the depths of that syrup rested laudanum, opium diluted and softened by sugar, its bitterness tamed until even the youngest lips could accept it. The sweetness masked the narcotic grip, and by the time the mother realized how heavily her child slept, the bottle was already half gone. Laudanum was not alone in its deception. Arsenic, ground into powder fine as flour, found its way into tonics blended with syrup and fruit juice. The sweetness obscured the sting, convincing the tongue it was harmless. In elegant parlours, fashionable ladies sipped arsenic-laced waters to achieve pale, delicate complexions, the very picture of refinement. Their cheeks grew hollow, their skin fragile as porcelain, yet the sweetness kept the ritual alive. They believed beauty was health, and if the drink was pleasant, surely it could not harm. Sweetness was more than flavour. It was a symbol of safety. For centuries, sugar had been rare, a treasure carried from distant lands at great cost. When it appeared in medicine, it gave the impression of refinement, of care, of a potion worthy of belief. The bitterness of wormwood or foxglove hinted at danger, but sugar whispered of gentleness. And so the deadliest medicines cloaked themselves in syrup, confident that the sweetness would silence suspicion. The streets themselves echoed with this promise. Vendors walked with wooden trays hung around their necks, selling lozenges that promised to ease coughs and strengthen lungs. Children followed, drawn by the sparkle of sugar crystals and the promise of relief disguised as candy. They sucked the lozenges slowly, savouring each grain that melted on their tongues, while the hidden tinctures crept silently into their veins. Parents, worn thin by endless nights of coughing, gladly paid a few coins for such a cure. Sweetness soothed the soul, even as it weakened the body. In the grand houses of the wealthy, the deception was more elaborate. Apothecaries created cordials of rare fruits, infused with spices, laced with narcotic clicks or stimulants. These were poured into crystal glasses, served with ceremony, their sweetness filling the air with promise. Guests raised their glasses, toasting to health and longevity, unaware that the sweetness masked the beginnings of dependency. Morphine, opium, cocaine, all were softened with sugar until they flowed across the palate like velvet. The sweet taste disarmed, encouraging indulgence. Children were especially vulnerable. Cough syrups designed for infants often contain not only sugar, but alcohol and opium. Mothers, desperate for quiet nights, trusted these remedies. The child would sleep soundly, the fever subdued, the crying silenced. Yet the silence stretched too long, and sometimes the child never woke. The sweetness had hidden the true danger, transforming poison into something tender, even nurturing. Generations grew up accustomed to the idea that medicine should taste good, that relief and sweetness were intertwined. Sweetness itself became an addiction, one that disguised the deeper chains forming beneath. Patients who first sought medicine for pain found themselves returning for the taste, for the comfort, for the illusion of strength that syrup provided. They poured it over and over, chasing the relief they remembered from the first spoonful. The body, slowly binding itself to the narcotic beneath, could not escape. Yet to the tongue, it was always sugar. The apothecaries and merchants rarely questioned their craft. They saw the relief on their customers' faces, heard their thanks, watched them return for more. The sweetness of the medicines made them popular, profitable, even celebrated. A bitter tonic might linger unsold, but a syrup bottle rarely gathered dust. Entire shops began to smell of molasses and honey, their shelves lined with amber liquids, catching the light. Sweetness sold, and what sold was repeated. But beneath this growing commerce lay consequences no sweetness could conceal. The pale complexion achieved by arsenic water became a mask for failing organs. The calm brought by laudanum gave way to dependence so profound that the sufferer could not sleep, could not eat, could not exist without another spoonful. The lungs that seemed soothed by sugary lozenges weakened under the quiet toll of adulterated ingredients. And children raised on narcotic syrups grew fragile, their bodies shaped by substances they had consumed since infancy. In these centuries, There was little to measure or test. No clear boundary between remedy and toxin. The apothecary's scales weighed sugar and poison in equal measure, blending them into mixtures that tasted reassuringly safe. The sweetness lulled entire populations into acceptance, building a culture where the flavour of medicine mattered as much as its effect. To refuse a syrup was to refuse comfort. To question it was to doubt the authority of the healer, the merchant, the generations of knowledge carried in dusty books and whispered recipes. The allure of sweetness was so great that even when doubts arose, they were often ignored. If a neighbour fell ill after a tonic, perhaps it was the disease, not the remedy. If a child failed to wake, perhaps the fever had been too strong. The syrup bottle itself remained innocent in the eyes of those who believed sweetness could not conceal cruelty. History, however, would later show that sweetness was the perfect disguise. The promise of these sweet cures endured for centuries, shaping not only medicine but culture itself. Even today, the expectation that medicine must be palatable, even pleasant, lingers as a legacy of those centuries when sugar first softened the taste of poison. Behind every cherry-flavoured cough syrup and honey-scented lozenge lies the shadow of those earlier concoctions, deadly in their disguise, lethal in their allure. For the apothecary, sweetness was both a tool and a trap. It made medicine acceptable, even desirable, but it also concealed the very dangers he dispensed. The promise he offered was wrapped in sugar, and the world accepted it willingly. Sweet cures drenched in poison became not an exception, but a tradition. And in the flicker of candlelight, as a mother spooned syrup into her child's mouth, the cycle of comfort and quiet devastation continued. Thus, sweetness, once a luxury, once a sign of wealth and delight, was transformed into a carrier of the deadliest medicines in history. And it was this sweetness, gentle and persuasive, that allowed the poisons of the age to seep deeper into human lives, unnoticed, unchallenged, and all the more enduring. There was something about shine that always caught the human eye. From the earliest days, people had been entranced by what glittered: gems, metals, the shimmer of light caught on water. And among the substances prized for their mystery, none gleamed more strangely, more seductively, than mercury. It was unlike anything else in the apothecary's collection. It moved like liquid silver, slipping across a surface in globes that broke apart and fused again, refusing to be held, as if it were alive. Even in dim candlelight, it shimmered like a treasure from another world. The apothecary kept it in glass vessels sealed tightly with wax, careful not to let the droplets escape. Customers gazed at it with awe when he poured it, the heavy liquid flowing like molten metal, its surface rippling with light. It seemed impossible that such a substance could exist. To many, its strange beauty suggested power. Something so alien to ordinary experience could only be medicine, sent by nature to heal where nothing else could. And so, mercury entered the human body as a promise. Bright, gleaming, and devastating, it was prescribed for fevers that lingered through the night, for swellings that would not subside, for headaches that refused to leave. It was mixed into ointments, rubbed onto skin in thick layers until it seeped slowly inward. It was swallowed in powders, its metallic bite hidden in mixtures of honey and wine. It was inhaled in vapours, the apothecary heating small bowls until the air shimmered with invisible threads. Each method carried the same hope, that mercury's otherworldly nature would banish illness. No illness carried more fear than the one that spread silently through the body, leaving rashes, sores, and a madness in its wake. Syphilis haunted entire cities, whispered about in alleys and behind closed doors. It was a disease of shame, of secrecy, and of suffering. And for centuries, mercury became its cure. The patient submitted to endless applications, enduring the stinging ointments, the metallic taste, the choking vapours. The phrase passed quietly from one generation to the next. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Those who endured such treatments rarely questioned them. The cure was as agonizing as the disease, but at least it offered the illusion of control. Fevers subsided for a time. Sores faded. Symptoms seemed to retreat. And so, physicians proclaimed Mercury a triumph, the shimmering saviour of the afflicted. Few paused to notice that those who survived the disease often perished from the cure. The symptoms of Mercury's poison crept slowly, easily mistaken for the lingering illness itself. Teeth loosened and fell, gums turned raw and bloody. Skin grew pale, then grey, marked with trembling hands and vacant eyes. Minds clouded into confusion, words slipping away, thoughts unravelling, but the patient, already weakened, already desperate, accepted these signs as the price of survival. The apothecary reassured them. The cure was working. The body was purging its sickness. The suffering meant progress. And so, people submitted again and again, clinging to the shimmering lie. Mercury did not remain confined to the treatment of one disease. Its allure spread wider, carried by its strange properties. It could dissolve gold, the noblest of metals, and so alchemists proclaimed it a key to transformation. If it could break down the unbreakable, surely it could dissolve illness within the body. It was rubbed into sores, sprinkled into wounds, prescribed for constipation, melancholy, and nearly every ailment that eluded understanding. The shimmering lie found a home in nearly every apothecary's shop, its reputation growing with each desperate patient who believed they had been saved. In the grand houses of Europe, Mercury found another use. The wealthy desired skin as pale as marble, untouched by the sun. Creams and powders laced with mercury provided this, bleaching the skin into unnatural whiteness. Women of fashion applied it daily, admiring their reflections in polished mirrors, unaware that the glow of their complexions concealed a slow erosion beneath. Mercury seeped quietly into their flesh, leaving its mark in trembling hands, aching bones, and minds that wandered into shadows. Yet still the creams sold, their glittering promise outweighing their invisible curse. Even children were not spared. Teething powders meant to soothe restless infants often contained mercury compounds ground into fine dust. Mothers sprinkled them on tiny gums, watching their babies quiet, unaware that the shimmering substance was quietly binding itself to the child's body. Many did not live long enough for the poison to fully reveal itself. Those who did carried its toll in fragile health, their futures shaped by the lie hidden in those powders. The shimmering lie endured because it was persuasive. It dazzled the eye, promised relief, and provided just enough temporary improvement to maintain belief. When symptoms faded, even briefly, it seemed proof that mercury worked. And when the body declined again, it was easy to blame the disease, not the cure. The cycle repeated endlessly, each generation inheriting the trust of the last. The lie shimmered, and few could look away. Beyond the apothecary, mercury seeped into other corners of life. Hatmakers handled it daily, brushing mercuric nitrate into felt to stiffen it. They inhaled its vapours until their hands trembled, their speech slurred, their minds faltered. The phrase "mad as a hatter" entered language, a quiet reminder of mercury's grip. Yet the practice continued, for stiff felt hats were fashionable, and the shimmering lie was too profitable to abandon. Miners, too, carried the burden. In the search for gold and silver, mercury was used to draw the metals from rock. Workers stood in fumes that shimmered in the air, breathing the poison deeply, their lungs filling with the silent weight. The shimmering lie followed them home, lingering in their bodies, shortening their lives. And still the world celebrated the wealth it brought, blind to the cost. The shimmering lie was not confined to one land or one people. Across continents, in different tongues, mercury's name carried the same weight of hope. It was quicksilver, argentum vivum, hydrogyrum, living silver. Its very names suggested vitality, motion, energy. Who could resist a medicine that seemed alive? The apothecaries bottled it with reverence, the physicians prescribed it with authority, and the sufferers consumed it with faith. Generations later, when the patterns of its poison became undeniable, the shimmering lie did not vanish. It merely shifted. New formulations, new promises, new disguises. Mercury pills to relieve constipation lingered well into the 19th century. Mercury ointments continued to be sold as skin treatments. Even as whispers of its dangers grew louder, the fascination with its shimmer held on. A lie that beautiful could not be easily abandoned. The truth of mercury is this: it never cured, it only concealed. It delayed symptoms, masked pain, created illusions of progress while hollowing the body from within. Its shimmer blinded humanity to its cruelty, persuading millions to accept its embrace. And because it glowed with a beauty unlike any other, people believed. The apothecary, standing before his shelves, could not have seen the full reach of the shimmering lie. He offered what tradition taught him, what customers demanded, what generations believed. He weighed the heavy droplets carefully, sealed the bottles, and repeated the promise: relief, restoration, healing. He did not see the trembling hands, the faltering speech, the madness that followed, or if he did, he could not bring himself to connect the shimmer with the suffering. Mercury's shimmering lie was one of the deadliest medicines ever sold, not because it killed quickly, but because it killed slowly, silently, and with beauty. It dressed itself in allure, in elegance, in the language of cures, and so it spread across centuries unchecked. Its glittering surface masked a history of pain etched into bodies, whispered through generations, hidden behind pale skin and trembling hands. And even now, long after the apothecary's jars have vanished, the memory of that shimmer lingers in history's shadows, a reminder that not all that glitters brings salvation. The world had already been lulled into trusting shimmering metals and sweetened syrups, but no substance captured human longing quite like the one that arrived in amber bottles, dark as evening itself. It poured thickly, clung to the sides of glass, and carried with it the scent of bitter earth softened by the weight of alcohol. The apothecary called it laudanum, the people called it rest. It was a concoction simple in its design, yet endless in its reach. Opium dissolved into wine or spirits, sometimes sweetened to soften its sharpness. The combination was both ancient and startlingly modern, a potion that promised not just healing, but escape. In laudanum, the weary found not merely relief from pain, but freedom from the heaviness of existence. It was medicine, dream, and silence, bottled together. The masses embraced it, because life, for most, was unrelenting. The body ached from endless labour, from long walks across cobblestones, from the damp cold of winters that never seemed to end. Children coughed through the night. Women bled and weakened through childbirth. Men broke their backs in fields and factories. Suffering was not an exception, but a daily companion. Laudanum offered a reprieve, one spoonful, and the edges of pain dulled. Another, and the world itself grew distant, softened, blurred into something almost gentle. It seeped into every household. Apothecaries sold it in small vials to the poor, and in ornate bottles to the wealthy. It was given to crying infants, to restless mothers, to fathers whose hands shook from strain. Physicians prescribed it for coughs, insomnia, headaches, melancholy, toothaches, and fevers. It was as common in a family's cupboard as bread or salt, the quiet answer to ailments both real and imagined. Few questioned it. When something seemed to cure everything, why should they? But laudanum did more than soothe. It seduced. Those who swallowed it once found themselves returning not simply out of need, but desire. The haze it brought was not merely relief, it was transformation. A day filled with endless drudgery could dissolve into one where time slowed, where the body felt weightless, where dreams arrived even before sleep. People who lived in cramped rooms, who smelled smoke and sewage in the streets, who felt only exhaustion at the end of each day, discovered in laudanum a world that was not theirs, but felt like it should be. The dreaming masses grew around it. Entire cities drifted into its embrace, quietly, without protest. In parlours and taverns, bottles of laudanum passed from hand to hand, as ordinary as cups of tea. Writers, musicians, and painters took it in greater doses, claiming that within its fog, the mind opened into new landscapes. The opium within sharpened imagination, even as it dulled the body, producing visions that found their way into poems, novels, and canvases. It was not only the ill who relied on laudanum, but the curious, the restless, the ambitious. The apothecary's shelves reflected this hunger. Rows of bottles lined up like a silent army, their contents thick and gleaming in the lamplight. He sold them without hesitation, for the demand never slowed. No ailment seemed beyond its reach. A man plagued by fever left with laudanum. A woman grieving a lost child left with laudanum. A child coughing through the night was hushed with laudanum. The masses were dreaming, and the dream was profitable, but beneath the dream lurked something far darker. The body adapted quickly, needing more to reach the same soft salt haze. What once was a spoonful became 2, then 3, then an entire bottle drained over days. Those who began with laudanum for pain soon found they could not rise in the morning without it. Mothers who once used it to soothe grief now used it to get through the day. Artists who drank for inspiration found themselves bound not to visions, but to chains of dependence. The dreaming masses did not awaken easily. Laudanum clung fiercely, weaving itself into blood and bone. Without it, hands trembled, stomachs twisted, minds broke into storms of restlessness and despair. People discovered too late that the medicine they trusted had not healed them, but claimed them. And yet, despite the evidence, the bottles continued to sell. Apothecaries knew their customers by name, watched them return week after week, their faces drawn, their eyes pleading. The promise had become a trap, and the masses walked willingly into it. Society itself shifted around this potion. In literature, laudanum appeared as both companion and curse, shaping the works of those who consumed it. The soft glow of dreams became a cultural motif, an undercurrent in stories told by candlelight, in paintings brushed onto canvas. Even as whispers of its dangers grew, laudanum held on to its image as something almost divine. After all, how could something so widely used, so deeply woven into daily life, truly be deadly? The lie was not one of shimmer, like mercury, nor of sweetness, like arsenic syrups. It was a lie of comfort. Laudanum whispered that suffering need not be endured, that sleep was always within reach, that dreams could replace reality. It whispered that ordinary life, with all its harshness, could be softened with just one sip. The people listened, and in listening, they gave themselves over to a medicine that never intended to let them go. The dreaming masses were not only the poor. Nobility too kept laudanum close. Ladies in fine gowns sipped from crystal glasses, praising its elegance as much as its effects. Gentlemen carried bottles in their pockets, taking drops before speeches, before meetings, before long evenings filled with talk. For the wealthy, it was not desperation but indulgence, a fashionable haze that dulled the edges of boredom and discontent. Laudanum crossed all boundaries, uniting rich and poor in a quiet, shared surrender. Doctors, for their part, recommended it freely. They saw patients return calmer, quieter, grateful. They observed symptoms fading, at least for a time, and considered laudanum a marvel of medicine. Few wished to confront the possibility that their miracle cure was also a slow poison. Even when deaths piled quietly in parish records, they were often attributed to the illnesses laudanum was meant to treat, not to the medicine itself. The dream concealed its cost with exquisite subtlety. And so, the masses continued dreaming, filling their nights with deep, heavy sleep, their days with softened edges, their lives with dependence they could not name. The apothecary's promise endured, reshaped into liquid opium, and society accepted it as naturally as it accepted bread, wine, or salt. The truth revealed itself slowly, like a whisper cutting through fog. Some began to notice the patterns, the children who never woke, the artists who wasted away, the mothers who grew paler with each passing week, unable to live without their bottles. But by then, laudanum had embedded itself too deeply. It was no longer simply a medicine, it was part of existence. To question it was to question the very fabric of daily life. The dreaming masses drifted through decades, bound together by amber liquid, lulled into believing they had found not just a cure, but a way of living. It was only later, when history looked back through the haze, that laudanum revealed itself as one of the deadliest medicines ever sold, not because it killed swiftly, but because it seduced entire generations into surrender, replacing reality with dreams one spoonful at a time. As the amber dreams of laudanum wound their way into parlours and tenements alike, another substance, far paler, almost delicate in its disguise, rested quietly in glass vials and finely polished jars. Where laudanum soothed with its dark warmth, this new medicine gleamed with elegance, its powders as silk, its liquids clear as water. To the eye, it carried none of the menace of poison. In truth, it was poison itself. Arsenic had long been known to the world as a silent killer. Whispers of its use threaded through the histories of palaces, of jealous heirs, of wives and rivals who wished to rid themselves of obstacles. It was a substance feared for its invisibility, its ability to slip into wine or food unnoticed, leaving behind only a pale, sickly trail in its victim. But in the centuries where medicine was as much faith as science, the line between poison and cure blurred. What killed in large doses was believed to heal in small ones. And so, arsenic entered the apothecary's trade not as a weapon, but as a tonic. The powders were mixed into elegant bottles, corked and labelled with graceful script. They were sold not in the shadows, but across polished counters, presented with quiet confidence. Arsenic was recommended for weak lungs, for asthma, for skin blemishes, for fatigue that clung too heavily to the body. Physicians spoke of its stimulating power, its ability to quicken the blood, to sharpen appetite, to restore the pale and weary into something vigorous again. And the public, eager for health, for vitality, listened. It became fashionable, in certain circles, to take arsenic deliberately, not in secret, but openly, even proudly. In Austria, stories circulated of young women in the countryside who ingested tiny amounts, believing it would bring a bloom to their cheeks, a lightness to their step, a brightness to their eyes. Their complexions indeed glowed, but the glow carried within it a shadow, the slow accumulation of poison that waited quietly beneath the surface. The elegant bottles of arsenic preparations found their way into homes as medicines for coughs and heart palpitations. Patent medicines, those cure-alls that filled newspaper columns with their extravagant claims, often slipped arsenic into their recipes. It was never presented as danger. On the contrary, the inclusion of such a powerful substance was proof, to the buyer, of the medicine's strength. The stronger the cure, the more certain the relief. The apothecary's shelves gleamed with these bottles. Some held liquid clear as spring water, others powders fine as flour, still others pills pressed neatly, each promising energy, beauty, or longevity. In every one, death rested in silence. The customer did not see it. They saw instead the polished glass, the flowing label, the assurance of modern science. To swallow a drop, to take a powder, was not merely to seek relief, it was to participate in progress, to step into a world where human suffering could finally be mastered. Arsenic had an allure that laudanum lacked. Laudanum carried with it the haze of intoxication, the dreamy drift into sleep. Arsenic promised sharpness instead. It whispered not of surrender, but of vigour. The weary clerk hoped it would strengthen his nerves. The factory worker believed it would keep his lungs clear of dust. The mother thought it might restore her complexion, weary from years of childbirth and toil. Each believed in the bottle, not because they misunderstood what arsenic was, but because they wanted to trust what it could become. And yet, as the elegant bottles multiplied, so too did the quiet tragedies. Patients who took arsenic as medicine grew ill, their stomachs tightening, their skin yellowing, their bodies wasting. Families whispered of mysterious deaths that followed treatments faithfully administered. But medicine was not blamed. The sickness itself was blamed, the cough, the weakness, the wasting fever. The cure remained blameless, protected by the faith that if it came from the apothecary's hand, it must surely do more good than harm. Even physicians, trained to observe patterns, often failed to see them. A patient arrived pale and coughing. He was given arsenic. Weeks later, the patient was weaker, vomiting, his stomach racked with pain. The physician noted his decline and prescribed more arsenic still, believing that the worsening of symptoms proved the illness was severe. The medicine's poison was mistaken for proof of its necessity. The lie of arsenic was not merely in its promise of health, but in its elegance. Unlike rough syrups or bitter tonics, it carried an air of refinement. Bottles sat neatly on mantels, their contents gleaming in the light of the hearth. The wealthy found comfort in its sophistication. The poor trusted it because it came with the authority of doctors and merchants alike. It was the most democratic of poisons, reaching across social boundaries, uniting rich and poor in their slow surrender to its touch. Women, in particular, were drawn to it. At a time when beauty was as much currency as coin, arsenic was whispered to brighten the skin, to whiten it with an unnatural glow. Cosmetics laced with arsenic were sold alongside medicines, blurring the line between treatment and adornment. A face smoothed with arsenic cream appeared radiant in candlelight, even as the substance seeped deeper, tightening its grip on blood and bone. The reflection in the mirror was the only evidence sought. and it seemed proof enough that the promise held true. Meanwhile, industries beyond medicine found their own use for arsenic. It tinted wallpapers a brilliant green, the kind that brightened parlours and ballrooms. It coloured fabrics, candies, even toys. The substance was everywhere, its dangers buried beneath its beauty. Children played in nurseries lined with arsenic-dyed wallpaper. Mothers sewed with threads laced with it. Fathers smoked pipes painted with it. To live in the modern world was, in ways unseen, to live within arsenic's reach. The apothecary, moving among his bottles, did not see himself as a merchant of death. He sold what was trusted, what was asked for, what society had deemed progress. He measured the powders with steady hands, poured the liquids with care, confident that his shelves carried relief, not ruin. His customers left satisfied, their hands clutching bottles that seemed too refined, too elegant to hold danger. History, though, recorded what those customers did not see. Parish registers noted the deaths, sudden illnesses, wasting diseases, unexplained fevers. Letters spoke of loved ones declining mysteriously after long courses of treatment. Newspapers occasionally whispered of arsenic's danger, but these voices were drowned by the louder chorus of advertisements, each promising restoration, vitality, beauty. The elegance of arsenic concealed its nature so thoroughly that entire generations accepted it without question. Where laudanum lulled the masses into dreams, arsenic gave them the illusion of vitality, even as it hollowed them from within. To swallow it was to participate in a ritual of self-destruction disguised as self-care. In the end, arsenic's story was not of sudden death, but of long, patient erosion. Families watched loved ones fade, never knowing that the elegant bottles they purchased with hope were the very agents of despair. The apothecary's shelves stood empty and full again, endlessly replenished, endlessly trusted, until at last medicine advanced enough to peer through the shimmer of elegance and recognize the truth. Yet in those years before knowledge deepened, arsenic reigned quietly, gracefully, in households across the world. It was a cure that never cured, a beauty that concealed decay, a promise dressed in refinement. And like all the deadliest medicines, it thrived because it told people exactly what they longed to hear. The shelves of apothecaries, lined with their neat rows of powders and tinctures, soon gave way to something far louder, far bolder, and infinitely more seductive. Medicine, once measured by the steady hands of the chemist, became a spectacle, a theatre of promises wrapped in colour and ink. The world entered an age not of quiet doses, but of wonders sold by name, by image, by story. The age of patent medicines had begun. In this new era, cures no longer whispered from behind wooden counters. They shouted from the pages of newspapers, from handbills pasted on city walls, from signs painted boldly across storefronts. A man or woman no longer needed a physician or apothecary to tell them what to buy. They needed only a coin in their pocket and a belief in the words they read. Medicines travelled not only in bottles, but in tales. Tales of miraculous recoveries, of life restored from the brink, of vigour and beauty poured from glass. The very word patent suggested authority, though most of these wonders were never truly patented in the legal sense. Instead, the word was borrowed, a trick of language meant to imply protection, legitimacy, vintian. Each bottle bore a name as grand as its promises. Dr. Bateman's petrol drops, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Holloway's pills, Hamlin's wizard oil. They carried the weight of invention, though most were nothing more than mixtures of alcohol, opiates, or cheap stimulants, dressed in rhetoric and faith. For the weary public, battered by endless waves of illness, poverty, and industrial life, these medicines were irresistible. A bottle that could be purchased without the expense of a doctor, without the judgment of a chemist, gave power to those who had little. Mothers soothed their infants with syrup, sweetened and darkened by narcotics. Labourers drank tonics spiked with alcohol before returning to the factory floor. Families placed their trust in pills that promised to purge them of all disease, never asking too closely what those pills contained. The advertisements were works of art in themselves. Lithographs showed radiant women rising from sickbeds, men restored to muscular health, cherubic children free of pain. The images suggested science had finally delivered what centuries of suffering had denied. Some medicines claimed to cure nearly everything: colds, headaches, indigestion, melancholy, even consumption. Others narrowed their focus but widened their reach: pills for female troubles, syrups for nervous complaints, tonics for manly vigour. The language was broad enough to capture anyone, precise enough to strike at private fears. Behind the flourish of ink and the grandeur of labels, the bottles themselves carried little more than familiar dangers. Laudanum lingered there still, now poured into syrups meant for infants. Morphine was hidden in tonics for exhaustion. Alcohol was the great base, strong enough to create a sense of relief after a sip, strong enough to leave the buyer convinced the medicine was working. Arsenic appeared again, tucked into pills that claimed to cleanse the blood. The apothecary's poisons had simply been given new costumes and louder voices. The wonder was not only in what these medicines claimed, but in how they travelled. Where once medicine had belonged to the local apothecary, now bottles shipped across oceans, stacked in crates, carried by trains and wagons to distant towns. A farmer in a remote village could take the same syrup as a banker in the city, both believing in the identical promise printed on the same label. Medicine had become democratic, universal, a product of commerce as much as cure. The streets themselves bore witness to the transformation. Posters layered one over another, bold letters promising immediate relief, miraculous recovery, secret formulas known only to the enlightened few. The competition was fierce. Each bottle needed not only to heal, but to dazzle. Names grew stranger, packaging brighter, claims bolder. If one bottle promised relief in a week, another claimed to restore health in a single night. If one syrup calmed coughs, another swore it could cure consumption outright. The people did not see deception. They saw hope. To live in an age of wonders was to believe that progress was not a slow, careful march, but a sudden leap forward, one that could be purchased cheaply, swallowed quickly, and felt almost at once. For a mother with a sick child, there was no greater miracle than a syrup that stopped the crying. For a man with aching joints, no comfort greater than a tonic that eased the pain, even if only for an evening. And so the age flourished. Newspapers depended on the revenue of patent medicine advertisements, and so their voices rarely questioned the claims. Doctors, when they did object, found themselves ignored or dismissed as narrow-minded. Why should the warnings of physicians outweigh the testimonies of thousands who swore by these bottles? The public did not ask what was inside. They asked only whether it worked, and if it seemed to, they cared little for the cost. Yet beneath the glitter of the age, tragedies multiplied quietly. Infants given soothing syrups fell into sleep too deep, never to wake again. Men who relied on invigorating tonics found themselves enslaved to alcohol or morphine hidden within. Women who swallowed pills for complexion or vitality began to waste, their bodies weakened by unseen toxins. But these deaths, scattered across towns and villages, did not gather into one voice loud enough to silence the advertisements. Each was seen as an isolated sorrow, not the symptom of an age. Patent medicine became not just a cure, but a culture. It changed how people thought about illness itself. No longer was disease something to be endured, its course uncertain, its end often grim. Now, every cough, every fever, every shadow of melancholy had an answer waiting in a bottle. The endless variety of remedies created the illusion that no suffering need remain unanswered. Whatever troubled you, somewhere on a shelf was a label that promised to take it away. The irony was that the medicines themselves often created the very symptoms they claimed to relieve. A syrup heavy with opium dulled pain, but left the body craving more. A tonic filled with alcohol lifted the spirit for an hour, but left the mind duller, the body weaker. Pills laced with stimulants gave bursts of energy that collapsed into exhaustion. The cycle fed itself. The cure demanded more cure. The relief demanded greater relief, until life itself was measured not in health, but in doses. The makers of these medicines thrived. Fortunes were built on the trade, mansions rising from the profits of pills that never healed. Some manufacturers became household names, their remedies as familiar as bread or tea. They were philanthropists, industrialists, figures of respect. Few dared to say aloud that their wealth was built upon a sea of hidden suffering. To question too closely was to risk being labelled an enemy of progress, of prosperity, of the very spirit of modern invention. And still, the bottles multiplied. On the mantelpiece, in the cupboard, on the bedside table, every home carried its collection of wonders. They stood not as warnings, but as comforts, symbols of hope within reach. The age of patent medicines was not merely about swallowing doses. It was about swallowing belief itself. Belief in progress, belief in science, belief in a world where suffering could be erased by ink, by glass, by the simple act of purchase. History would later look back and call it naivete, a time of deception, of charlatans and profiteers. But to those who lived it, it was simply the world as it was, bright, hopeful, full of promises, bottled and sold. And for all the tragedies it carried, it also carried the quiet truth of human longing, the desire for health, for beauty, for relief, even if it meant drinking from a glass filled with death. In the stillness of that age, when posters fluttered on every street corner and bottles gleamed in every home, the wonders seemed endless. They carried the world forward, not by healing it, but by teaching it to believe that healing could be bought. And so the story drifted onward, not with silence, but with the rustle of paper advertisements, the clink of glass bottles, and the whispered hope that the next sip, the next pill, the next drop might finally deliver what all the others had not. The patent wonders of the 19th century, with their gilded names and extravagant promises, had a way of opening doors to substances that might otherwise have remained curiosities. Among them was a leaf long known to the people of South America, a leaf chewed in the thin air of the Andes to ease fatigue, to sharpen endurance, to soften hunger. It was humble in its natural form, passed from hand to hand, its power drawn slowly from the fibres of green. But when European chemists set their eyes upon it, they did what the age did best. They stripped it down, refined it, and poured its essence into bottles. Thus cocaine entered the world not as a whisper from a mountain, but as a cure held for every illness. The late 19th century was a time hungry for stimulants. Industry demanded bodies that could labour longer, minds that could think faster, spirits that could resist the weight of exhaustion. Cocaine appeared as a revelation, a powder bright and pure, quick to act, leaving behind a clarity so sharp it seemed like the very definition of health. Doctors praised it in journals, patients marvelled at its effects, and manufacturers, ever eager for a new miracle, turned it into tonics, lozenges, wines, and even toothache drops for children. The bottles bore names designed to inspire confidence. Vin Mariani was perhaps the most famous, a tonic wine laced with cocaine that became a favourite across Europe and America. Its advertisements carried the faces of famous figures, from artists to politicians, each praising its effects. To sip the wine was to join a lineage of brilliance, of creativity sharpened, of energy restored. Other preparations followed quickly: coca syrups for fatigue, coca tablets for nerves, coca teas for digestion. There was no ailment too small, no condition too vague, that could not be touched by the white powder. The medical world embraced it eagerly. Surgeons discovered that cocaine could numb pain, and suddenly operations that once required crude restraint could be attempted with a kind of precision unknown before. Dentists dripped cocaine onto aching gums, marvelling at how quickly the agony dissolved. Ophthalmologists dropped it into eyes, using its anaesthetic power to perform delicate procedures that would once have been impossible. Cocaine became not merely a tonic, but a tool, a doorway to new kinds of medical ambition. Patients, meanwhile, found in it a different kind of relief. A mother weary from endless days found her spirits lifted with a spoonful of coca syrup. A clerk, dulled by ledgers and long hours, discovered energy in a pinch of powder. A student, anxious before examinations, sharpened his mind with tablets that seemed to cut through fog. Even children were given coca preparations, their restlessness tamed, their toothaches eased, their little bodies slipping into quiet under the influence of a substance that carried within it both promise and peril. The beauty of cocaine, to those who sold it, was its immediacy. Unlike slower tonics or uncertain syrups, cocaine acted quickly. Its effects could be felt within moments. The heart lifted, fatigue banished, a brightness seeping into thought and body alike. This swiftness convinced people that it was not just medicine, but a kind of truth. If something could act so quickly, surely it must be working at the deepest level, repairing what was wrong, restoring what was broken. Yet beneath the sheen of miracle, the substance carried its own shadows. Patients who began with a single dose found themselves returning, not because their illness worsened, but because they longed for the sensation itself. Cocaine's clarity was seductive, its energy addictive. Physicians began to notice patients who demanded more, who seemed unable to function without their tonics or powders. But at first this was not seen as danger. It was seen as proof of the medicine's power. A body that craved cocaine, they thought, must surely be a body that needed it. The industry fed this belief. Advertisements proclaimed cocaine's harmlessness, its natural origin, its ability to strengthen rather than weaken. A poster might show a radiant woman lifting a glass of coca wine, her cheeks flushed, her posture strong. Another showed a scholar bent over books, his mind alight with coca tablets. Cocaine was not sold as a drug. It was sold as refinement, as vitality in bottled form. To reject it was to reject modernity itself, to cling to a slower, weaker age. Even the world of art and literature was touched by it. Writers praised its ability to keep them at their desks, words flowing faster, ideas brighter. Musicians spoke of energy that carried them through performances without falter. The very creative spirit of the age seemed bound up with this new medicine, as though the white powder itself had become the fuel of genius. That it hollowed men out behind the brilliance, that it left them restless, anxious, or broken, was a truth too easily ignored. The wider public, meanwhile, found comfort in the accessibility of cocaine. It could be purchased at the corner store, ordered by mail, carried home in a paper packet or a corked vial. No prescription was needed, no doctor's gatekeeping required. Cocaine belonged to the people now, and they welcomed it with open hands. In cities swelling with smoke and labour, in towns weighed down by monotony, the powder seemed like a gift, an equalizer, a friend, a promise of more hours in the day and more strength in the body. Yet slowly, unease began to creep in. Stories surfaced of men who collapsed after too many doses, of women who grew pale and frantic, unable to sleep, unable to eat without their coca tonics. Physicians began to notice that patients who relied on cocaine often grew worse rather than better, their bodies consumed by a restless hunger that no amount of medicine could satisfy. The same clarity that first brought relief began to fray, leaving behind exhaustion deeper than before. Still, the age was not ready to let go. Cocaine had been woven too deeply into the fabric of medicine and commerce. It lingered in wines, in tablets, in syrups, in the powders slipped into toothache drops and tonics. Parents continued to give it to children, trusting the labels that promised harmless relief. Artists continued to praise it, their words ringing louder than the quiet warnings of physicians. Industry continued to sell it, the profits too rich to abandon. The paradox of cocaine was the same as that of so many medicines of the age. It revealed itself quickly as both cure and curse, yet the world chose to see only the cure. It was easier to believe in the miracle than to face the cost. To sip coca wine at a salon, to drop cocaine into a patient's eye, to swallow a tablet before work. These acts felt like progress, like evidence that humanity was mastering its own frailties. The shadows that followed were seen not as warnings, but as unfortunate accidents, isolated sorrows in a sea of triumph. And so cocaine spread, moving from chemists' benches to parlours, from operating tables to nursery rooms. It was everywhere, in forms elegant and humble, each claiming to heal, to restore, to invigorate. Its legacy was not only in the bottles it filled, but in the illusions it sustained. That health could be purchased, that vitality could be poured from glass, that the sharp brightness of a moment could outweigh the slow decline it carried in its wake. In time, the world would learn to see through the illusion, to measure the cost against the promise. But in the glow of its first arrival, cocaine was nothing less than a marvel, a powder that touched every corner of life, a medicine for every illness, a fleeting dream that mankind was eager to believe. From the sharp brightness of cocaine's promise, the story of medicine drifts toward something quieter, heavier, and infinitely more seductive. Where cocaine cut like a flash of light, morphine wrapped itself like velvet, soft and irresistible, drawing countless souls into its slow embrace. If the world greeted cocaine as a stimulant for every ailment, morphine emerged as a balm for suffering, the one substance that could ease pain when nothing else could. It was a medicine of compassion, and at the same time, a medicine of chains. The tale of morphine begins with the poppy, a flower whose milky sap had lulled humanity since the dawn of history. Ancient civilizations had known its power, cultivating it not for beauty alone, but for the dreamy darkness hidden within its pods. But it was in the early 19th century that the flower's gift was refined, crystallized into something precise and potent. A German pharmacist's son, Friedrich Saturner, seeking to isolate what made the poppy's sap so strangely powerful, produced small crystals that carried more weight than he could have guessed. He named them after Morpheus, the god of dreams, never suspecting how fitting that name would become. Morphine was unlike anything medicine had seen. A few milligrams could banish agony, softening the cries of those torn by injury, disease, or surgery. For the first time, physicians could offer relief that was not vague or uncertain, but immediate and overwhelming. Wounds that had once condemned men to endless torment could now be soothed. Operations that once required brute endurance could be performed with patients spared from screaming. Morphine seemed to answer one of humanity's oldest prayers, the plea to escape pain. Doctors embraced it with fervour. The 19th century was a world filled with injury. Industrial accidents, battlefield wounds, childbirth gone wrong, epidemics tearing through cities. Pain was everywhere, woven into daily existence, and here was a medicine that could quiet it. Hospitals became places where morphine was dispensed as freely as bandages, physicians carrying it in glass vials, nurses administering it with steady hands. The invention of the hypodermic needle only deepened its hold, for now morphine could be delivered directly into the bloodstream, quick as breath, certain as nightfall. Patients too welcomed it as a miracle. Soldiers returning from battle found their wounds numbed, their nights less haunted, their bodies given respite from unrelenting agony. Women weakened by illness discovered rest they had not known in months. Children with fevers or infections slipped into soft slumber, their suffering eased. In every corner of society, morphine was hailed as a gift. It soothed the dying, comforted the grieving, steadied the hands of surgeons, and made unbearable lives just a little more bearable. But the velvet touch of morphine carried within it threads of iron. The same qualities that made it so effective, the swiftness, the completeness of its relief, made it impossible to resist. Patients who had relied on morphine for weeks found that their bodies cried out without it. The first stirrings of dependence were often overlooked. A request for one more dose, a prescription extended a little longer, a vial kept close at hand. Physicians themselves were not immune, many falling into the very habit they prescribed, their days ordered around injections that softened fatigue and dulled worry. The American Civil War left perhaps the most haunting legacy. Thousands of wounded soldiers, treated for shattered limbs, for infections that gnawed at the bone, were given morphine in quantities that seemed merciful at the time. Many survived their injuries only to emerge bound to the drug. Their dependence became so common it earned a name: the soldier's disease. Veterans carried their syringes home, the battlefield following them into civilian life, the velvet chains of morphine as lasting as their scars. What made morphine so insidious was its double nature. It relieved suffering so completely that to deny it seemed cruel, yet to give it freely was to risk binding patients to it forever. Doctors stood in a paradox they could not resolve. A mother with cancer begged for sleep. A man racked by tuberculosis coughed until blood filled his handkerchief. A soldier lay awake night after night with phantom pain burning in a limb no longer there. To withhold morphine was unthinkable. To give it was to set them adrift on a current that might never release them. Society, meanwhile, began to notice the shadows that followed in morphine's wake. Advertisements still praised its wonders, but whispers of its dangers spread. Families spoke of loved ones who could not function without their injections, who wasted away in pursuit of the next dose, who seemed less alive with each passing month, even as the drug kept them technically alive. Women especially were often prescribed morphine for ailments ranging from menstrual pain to nervous conditions, and many slipped quietly into lifelong dependency. Behind the closed curtains of respectable homes, addiction grew, hidden yet persistent, as silent as the medicine itself. Morphine addiction did not announce itself with chaos. It was not violent, not loud. It unfolded slowly, almost elegantly, in the dim corners of sick rooms and studies. Patients did not always fall apart in public. They simply grew more distant, more withdrawn, their lives revolving around the velvet ritual of the syringe. Families whispered, but rarely intervened. After all, The medicine was prescribed by doctors, sold in pharmacies, delivered in bottles that bore the stamp of legitimacy. This was no illicit vice. It was modern science, modern mercy. And yet the chains tightened. Dependence became suffering in its own right. A cycle of relief followed by craving, of peace followed by desperation. Physicians struggled to reconcile their roles as healers with the reality that they had created new illnesses, even as they tried to cure old ones. Some began to warn of the dangers, but their voices were muted against the tide of demand. The world was not ready to turn away from a medicine that promised so much, even if it delivered destruction alongside relief. There was also a strange dignity in morphine's embrace. To drift into its haze was not the frantic rush of stimulants, nor the staggering collapse of drink, but a quiet slide into comfort. It was easy to imagine it as benign, even when it hollowed lives from within. Patients described it as a soft fog, a gentle warmth spreading through the body, a release not only from pain but from the anxieties and sharpness of life itself. For many, especially those already dying, morphine was less a chain than a pillow, and they clung to it gratefully. But for those who lived, those who sought not death but daily life, the medicine proved merciless. The cycle of craving and relief became the center of existence. Relationships eroded, ambitions dissolved. Morphine did not shout. It whispered, it soothed, it convinced its victims that they were cared for, even as it took everything away. Its chains were velvet because they were soft, comforting, deceptively kind. Only when tightened did their true strength show. Governments and medical bodies eventually began to take notice. By the late 19th century, whispers had grown into concern. Journals recorded cases of addiction with unease, and attempts were made to restrict access. Yet the paradox remained: how to deny a substance that truly did ease the most unbearable suffering? The world had stumbled upon a medicine too powerful to abandon, yet too dangerous to embrace without cost. The debate would stretch on for decades, unresolved, as morphine continued its quiet work in hospitals, in homes, in wars yet to come. For in every new conflict, morphine was there. In every epidemic, it was ready. In every hospital ward, it waited in glass vials, its clear liquid glinting under the gaslight. The velvet chains spread, binding not just individuals, but entire generations to the poppy's dream. The story of medicine could not escape it. No matter how many warnings rose, no matter how many lives were marked, morphine remained essential. Its paradox became permanent. The deadliest medicine was also the most merciful. And so, morphine continued to move quietly through the veins of the century, its presence as inevitable as suffering itself. It taught the world that a cure could also be a curse, that the greatest relief might carry the heaviest price. It whispered in sick rooms, on battlefields, in parlours, in the hands of doctors who both revered and feared it. Its velvet chains bound more than patience. They bound the very history of medicine, tightening softly, leaving marks that would never fade. The centuries had been defined by powders, tinctures, syrups and crystals, each carrying its promise and its curse. But as the 19th century drew to a close, medicine began to look beyond the plants and minerals of old, reaching instead into the invisible realms of science, where discoveries seemed more like magic than chemistry. The age of laboratories and glowing substances had arrived, and at its heart was a substance so new, so radiant, that it seemed to shine with divine favour. Radium. When Marie and Pierre Curie announced its discovery at the turn of the century, the world was already fascinated by the unseen forces of the universe. Electricity lit homes where once only candles had burned. X-rays revealed bones inside living bodies. The invisible had become tangible, and the human imagination leapt toward every strange new force with eagerness. Among these marvels, radium gleamed most brightly. It was matter itself transformed into light, glowing faintly in the dark, as though it carried a secret from the stars. It did not take long for physicians and entrepreneurs to see in this glow the promise of healing. If radium could burn tumours, perhaps it could burn away every illness. If it could destroy tissue, might it also destroy disease? The line between destruction and cure blurred, as it often does in medicine, and radium was embraced with a fervour that bordered on worship. Tiny glass vials filled with glowing solutions appeared in pharmacies. Ointments, creams, and tonics were infused with trace amounts of radium, sold with the confident assurance that a luminous substance must also bring luminous health. Pamphlets declared that radium restored vitality, banished fatigue, invigorated the blood, sharpened the mind. Advertisements promised not just healing, but rejuvenation. To drink radium water, to bathe in radium salts, was to touch eternity. The wealthy were among the first to indulge. High society sought out radium spas, where waters supposedly infused with the element promised to restore vigour to tired bodies. Elegant bottles of radium water were sold as luxuries, their glow itself a sign of their worth. For those who could afford it, the dream of eternal youth was now poured into glasses and sipped with confidence. The glow itself seemed proof enough. If it shone in the dark, surely it must illuminate the body from within. Yet it was not only the privileged who welcomed radium. Ordinary people, weary from long hours in factories, suffering from chronic ailments for which traditional medicines offered no relief, also sought the glow. Patent medicines infused with radium lined the shelves beside the tonics and syrups of the past. Pills promised to carry the power of modern science into even the humblest home. The dream of healing was democratized, each dose a fragment of starlight swallowed in hope. Doctors, too, experimented eagerly. Hospitals embraced radium therapy with enthusiasm, applying it directly to cancers and growths. Patients who had been given little chance of survival submitted willingly, trusting in the brilliance of science to save them. And sometimes, astonishingly, the tumours did shrink, the pain did ease, the disease did recede. Radium was not merely illusion, its destructive power was real, and it gave just enough success to fuel its legend. But as with so many of medicine's brightest promises, the shadows soon lengthened. The glow that had seemed so life-giving began to reveal its hunger. The very property that allowed radium to destroy tumours also destroyed flesh indiscriminately. Patients treated with radium burns found their skin sloughing away, their bones weakening, their bodies failing in ways they could not have imagined. The same invisible rays that shrank disease gnawed at the marrow of health itself. Still, the fascination persisted. For every story of damage, there were testimonials of improvement. For every whisper of danger, an advertisement shouting hope. The world was not ready to turn away from such a glittering miracle. Radium had become too deeply woven into culture. It appeared in cosmetics, in toothpaste, even in chocolate and butter. A glowing complexion was no longer just a metaphor. It was a product sold across counters, wrapped in promises that sparkled as brightly as the substance itself. Workers, often young women, were employed to handle radium in factories, producing luminous watch dials. They dipped their brushes into glowing paint, pointing the bristles with their lips, laughing as they left faint trails of light in their hair, their clothes, even their smiles. They called themselves the Ghost Girls because they glowed in the dark after their shifts. To them, it was a harmless novelty. a perk of their unusual work. Only later would the truth emerge. As their jaws decayed, their bones crumbled, and their bodies betrayed them in ways both gruesome and irreversible. The tragedy of the dial painters became one of the most haunting chapters of radium's story. These women, promised wages and dignity in an era when both were scarce, instead found themselves consumed from within by the very substance they had been told was safe. Their suffering became a grim reminder that the marvels of science often bore hidden costs, and their lawsuits against the companies that employed them marked some of the earliest battles for worker safety in industrial history. Yet even as their bodies failed, advertisements continued to praise radium's vitality, and glowing waters were still poured at dinner tables. The paradox deepened. Radium truly did have medical uses. It could shrink cancers when used carefully, and its role in the development of radiation therapy was undeniable. But the line between treatment and poison was vanishingly thin, and in the early days of its discovery, no one knew where that line lay. A few drops might invigorate or destroy. A glowing pill might energize or unravel flesh and bone from within. Hope and harm were inseparable, each sip carrying both promise and peril. By the 1920s, cracks in radium's reputation could no longer be ignored. Doctors began to recognize patterns of illness in patients who had embraced radium therapies. Investigators documented the horrific conditions of dial painters, and yet the allure did not fade overnight. People are slow to abandon wonder, and slower still to abandon the belief that they might escape mortality. Radium lingered in medicine cabinets and on vanity tables, glowing faintly in the dark, its light both beautiful and damning. It is easy now to dismiss those who drank radium water or applied radium creams as naive. But their faith was not in ignorance alone. They lived in an age of miracles, when invisible rays could see through flesh, when wires carried voices across oceans, when light bulbs burned brighter than fire. In such a world, who could doubt that a substance glowing with its own inner light might be the key to health, vigour, and long life? It was not foolishness. It was hope, dressed in the garb of science, offered in bottles that shimmered in the dark. And so the glow of radium became not only a story of medicine, but a story of longing. Longing to heal, to endure, to outwit the body's inevitable decline. Longing to capture the light of the universe and hold it inside fragile human flesh. For a time, radium seemed to grant that wish, until its hidden cost revealed itself too starkly to ignore. The light faded, not with a single moment of revelation, but slowly, as regulations tightened, as lawsuits drew attention, as the glow in factories dimmed and the promises in advertisements grew quieter. Yet even as it receded from the shelves of pharmacies and the bottles of spas, radium left behind more than tragedy. It left the beginnings of radiation therapy, tools that in careful hands would one day save countless lives. It left lessons about caution, about the fine line between medicine and poison, about the dangers of embracing miracles without question. The glow that once seemed eternal dimmed into history, remembered not as the elixir of life, but as a warning carved into bone. Still, it lingers in the imagination, the strange beauty of a substance that shimmered in darkness, that promised healing even as it delivered death. Few medicines in history carried such poetry, such contradiction. Few left such luminous scars. And so the story moves forward, carrying with it the faint afterglow of radium, a reminder that the brightest lights in medicine often cast the darkest shadows. The search for vigour that once lured people to glowing waters and luminous creams eventually bent toward a smaller, darker seed, a seed whose reputation moved between remedy and reckoning, like a moth circling a candle. In the long parade of substances turned into medicine, strychnine wore the oddest costume, a tonic for life. It promised sharpened nerves, brighter eyes, keener strength, and the return of a man's or woman's lost fire. It arrived in tiny doses, often disguised inside bottles that spoke of health and modernity, and it taught its believers a hard lesson about how close stimulation and destruction can sit to one another. The plant that bears the reputation grew in places where old herbal lore already had deep roots. Local healers knew the seeds as powerful, respected them for their capacity to wake the body, and used them in carefully measured ways. When Western medicine reached into this repository of knowledge, it stripped the seed down to an active principle and presented it in crystal form, potent, transportable, and fit for the laboratory. Once purified and packaged, the alkaloid was easy to dose, a tiny speck on a pill, a pinch in a syrup, and that convenience made it irresistible to an age hungry for quick fixes. Its appeal was simple and immediate. People who struggled with chronic weakness, who emerged pale and exhausted from industrial labour or from the long drag of illness, were offered a promise, a brightening of nerve, a tightening of will, a return to the body's former capacities. Advertisements named it without shame. Physicians prescribed it without fear. Tonics containing minute amounts of the substance were marketed for nervous debility, for worn-out systems, for loss of vigour. The word tonic itself sounded like renewal. One swallowed a little strength and set back out into the world with more to give. There was, too, a cultural hunger that fed the substance's rise. The modern era prized utility and speed. Workdays lengthened, technologies demanded new rhythms, and the body was expected to keep pace. When a pill or a draught promised to restore alertness or to steady the hand, people reached for it as they might for a lantern in a fog. Medicine had become practical and pragmatic. Less mysticism, more function. If a dose could sharpen the senses for 12 hours of labour, or steady the trembling of a man returning to the shop floor, who would begrudge it its place on the bedside table? Companies turned the stimulant into an ingredient. Pill makers folded it into complex formulas of gentian, iron, and aromatic bitter herbs. Syrup makers stirred it into sweetened alcohol bases. Patent medicines boasted its presence as proof of potency. The bottle you bought at the apothecary's window might promise improved appetite, more robust digestion, and a brighter disposition. The label's tiny type listing strychnine as one among many secret components that assured you practical results. It felt scientific to include a refined alkaloid on the ingredient list. It felt modern to swallow a manufactured remedy rather than an old folk elixir. The authority of science wrapped itself in discourse of recovery and productivity. For a while, the results seemed to justify the promise. A man who had gone pale from long nights could return to work that afternoon with renewed posture. A woman racked by exhaustion after childbirth found her days easier after a measured dose. There were accounts, earnest and persuasive, of people regaining appetites and zest. Even physicians who had learned temperate practices in other eras now found themselves reaching for stimulants when desperate cases presented, to rouse a nearly comatose patient, to counter prolonged fainting spells, to treat what they described as a tired nervous system that had no other answer. Yet potency carries a double edge. Strychnine works by exciting the nervous system. In the tiniest of measured amounts, it can produce alertness. In doses that are only a little larger, it produces over-excitation. The body that once answered with renewed energy would, if pushed beyond a narrow threshold, convulse and writhe. Those convulsions were not merely alarming, they were terrifying. They could mimic other conditions, tetanic stiffness, seizures of various etiologies, and in an era where diagnostic tools were crude, such overlaps could shield the true cause from sight. Families might watch a loved one shake and describe the event as an attack, without grasping that the medicine itself had lit the fuse. The line between cure and catastrophe became emotionally fraught in households where tonics were freely used. A mother could, in a blink, go from giving her child a calming draught to watching the child fall into uncontrollable spasms. An overnight guest, slipping a stimulant into his pocket to meet a busy morning, could find himself seized with convulsions that left him collapsed and rigid. In many stories of the time, such tragedies were swallowed into private sorrow. People learned, slowly and painfully, to be wary of bottles whose labels promised too much. Public life, meanwhile, displayed other complications. In an age hungry for advantage, physical, mental, professional, the stimulant's potential for performance enhancement could not be ignored. Athletes and labourers sought out small doses to sustain endurance. Intellectuals took pills late into the night to battle sleep for the sake of deadlines and inspiration. The effect was deceptive. Bodies felt more responsive, minds sharper, but the tail of that experience could be a harder, rawer fatigue. Long-term dependence upon a stimulant that excites the nervous system in such a direct way produced a brittle, precarious energy. Behind the show of increased stamina lay a system gradually unbalanced by constant provocation. Controversy grew in doctors' writings and in the papers. Professors of medicine debated whether a drug that could provoke such violent effects should be relegated to the domain of specialists. For a time, regulation lagged. Patent makers found creative ways to disguise quantities, and governments hesitated to be seen as denying their citizens a panacea of vigour. That hesitation carried moral and practical weight. For many families, the stimulant's slim promise was the only hope for those debilitated by prolonged poverty and disease. To ban or restrict was to remove an accessible remedy from the hands of those who could least afford medical care. At the same time, the same compound that lived in the medicine chest found a darker life as a tool for murder. Its taste could be masked, its effects mistaken for natural causes in a time when forensic science was primitive. Stories circulated, some true, some sensationalized, of inheritance unravelings and poisonings that used the stimulant's lethal profile to tragic effect. That tendency to hide in plain sight, to function as a legitimate medicine one moment and a deadly agent the next, made strychnine particularly unnerving. It taught society that chemicals are morally neutral until shaped by use, and that the same knowledge that heals can also be twisted into harm. Medical practice adapted, slowly. Physicians learned to be cautious with dosing, to watch for early signs of overstimulation, to educate patients about the narrow threshold between benefit and danger. Laboratories refined detection methods, and as analytical chemistry improved, the ability to identify toxic exposures in bodies and foods grew clearer. Public health eventually caught up with commerce. Laws were enacted to restrict pure alkaloids and to label tonics more honestly. The marketplace shifted as better understanding of pharmacology reached the public, and the era of free-for-all stimulant tonics quietly gave way to more regulated treatments. Still, the cultural aftershocks remained. The age had been taught, deeply, that there existed in a bottle a quick insertion of energy that could redeem fatigue and restore performance. That lesson would not evaporate easily. It migrated into subsequent generations as a tacit acceptance of pharmaceutical solutions to the body's slow pains. Where once the seed's essence had been used modestly in folk practice, it had been modernized into a symbol. Medicine could and should sharpen a person to meet the modern world's demands. That belief outlived the particular chemistry of the alkaloid itself. Beyond regulations and debates, the human stories endure. There are quiet accounts of those who swore the stimulant brought back their capacity to love, to work, or to simply stand upright after fever laid them low. There are also the other narratives, families that watched loved ones convulse after misjudged doses, youths whose appetites for energy became compulsion, white-collar workers who relied upon tiny stimulants to push through the factory hours, only to find the edge become an abyss. These contradictions, relief and ruin, recovery and wreckage, are threaded through the history of Strychnine's life in medicine. By the time medicine moved past unregulated tonics toward evidence-guided therapeutics, the stimulant's reign as a common tonic had waned. New classes of drugs, safer and more controllable, took its place. Yet the lesson remained stubborn. Substances that promise renewal can exact steep tolls if used without full understanding. The seed's distilled alkaloid receded from kitchen cabinets and pocket flasks, but its spectre lingered in the public imagination as a warning and as a monument to an era when the desire for quick strength outpaced the slow work of learning consequences. History collects these episodes not to shame, but to clarify. Strychnine as a tonic for life is, in itself, a story about yearning, the wish to be more resilient, to rebound faster, to survive the unceasing demands of modernity. It is also a story about humility, the scientific and cultural humility that comes only after hard lessons about the cost of shortcutting the body's rhythms. The small seeds that once promised miraculous vigour taught humanity, in ways that sometimes cost lives, that healing requires more than hope and a bottle. It requires measurement, restraint, and an understanding of the fragile balances within us. And so the narrative moves on, carrying this knowledge forward as it folds into the next chapter of medical ambitions, into newer substances, different promises, and the perennial tension between what the body is and what society asks of it. The tonic's bright whisper fades, leaving behind caution and memory. From that hush arises the next temptation, the next remedy dressed as salvation, waiting politely in its glass bottle for someone to believe. The dusty roads of the 19th century were lined with more than just carriages and wagons. They were lined with promises. Brightly painted carts rumbled into small towns, their wheels creaking under the weight of barrels, crates and trunks stuffed with bottles. The names painted across the wood were always cheerful, bursting with words like miracle, elixir, and cure. People leaned out from shop fronts, mothers nudged their children to step aside, and tired men stopped their work to see what the commotion was about. Because these wagons weren't only selling goods, they were selling hope. The show often began before the bottles were even touched. Out would step a man in a tall hat or a finely cut coat, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter of the street. He'd clap his hands, call out to the crowd, and perhaps even strike up a tune on a fiddle or a brass horn. A gathering formed quickly, curiosity pulling people closer. The man would bow, sweep his arms wide, and introduce himself with grand titles, doctor, professor, or specialist, names chosen not because they were earned, but because they impressed. And behind him, sometimes on a makeshift stage, an assistant might juggle, or a woman dressed in bright silks might hold aloft a bottle that glittered like amber in the sunlight. "Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, step right up," the man would say. "What ails you? A cough that rattles your ribs? A back that bends with pain? A fever that burns the skin? We have the answer. Right here, in this bottle, a cure for every ill under heaven." What lay in those bottles varied. Some were simple mixtures of alcohol and sugar, with herbs added for flavour. Others carried more sinister contents: laudanum, morphine, chloroform, or even strychnine in doses small enough to stir rather than kill. Many contained turpentine, camphor, ammonia, or kerosene, harsh substances meant to sting the tongue, leaving the impression of power. The harsher the burn, the more convinced the crowd became that something potent was at work. The salesman knew that if it hurt a little, it must surely heal. The bottles often bore labels that read like poetry. Dr. Wilkins' Vital Elixir of Life, Professor Carter's Universal Remedy, the Golden Oil of Eternal Youth. Each line dripped with exaggeration, but in a world where doctors were scarce, hospitals often distant, and medicine expensive, these bottles felt within reach. They were cheap enough to buy, but costly enough to seem legitimate. A few coins exchanged hands, and soon a farmer, a seamstress, or a miner would tuck a vial of amber liquid into a pocket, convinced they now carried protection against all manner of suffering. But the sale was only part of the performance. These peddlers knew how to make a crowd believe. Assistants, planted in the audience, would limp forward, pretending to suffer from lameness or coughs, only to sip the elixir and stand miraculously straight, their voice cleared. Children were brought up and given drops on their tongue, smiling wide as the crowd clapped. Some troops even carried their own brass bands to drown out doubts with music, while others travelled with painted banners that showed miraculous recoveries. A bent old man standing tall, a pale woman blooming with rosy cheeks. The effect was dazzling, and for a brief moment, the line between spectacle and salvation blurred. Behind the glitter, however, was a harsher reality. Many of these remedies offered nothing more than intoxication. A sip of the tonic might numb the body with alcohol, dull pain with opiates, or produce a buzzing energy if it contained cocaine. Relief was real, but it was fleeting, followed by dependence, collapse, and sometimes death. A child soothed with a few drops of morphine-laced syrup might never wake again. A weary labourer who drank too deeply of a stimulant tonic might collapse of heart failure. Yet, in that moment of purchase, few questioned. Desperation and hope outweighed caution. The business thrived because it fed off uncertainty. People had heard of modern medicine, but often distrusted it. Doctors were sometimes seen as cold, expensive, or even cruel with their treatments of bleeding and purging. By contrast, the travelling salesman was friendly, approachable, and persuasive. He spoke in simple words, painted visions of recovery, and handed over bottles with a smile and a story. And when he left town, rattling away in his painted cart, he carried not just money, but the belief of those he left behind, who clutched their vials like charms against fate. What made these snake oil salesmen so successful wasn't only what they sold, but how they fit into the culture of the time. The 19th century was restless. Railroads stretched further, towns sprang up overnight, and populations shifted quickly. Amid all that change, the familiar figure of the travelling medicine man felt both exotic and reassuring. He was a visitor from afar, bringing something new, yet also someone who seemed to carry wisdom older than the towns themselves. And when life was full of uncertainties, poor harvests, epidemics, injuries from labour, these bottles became anchors. They gave people the illusion of control, a sense that with a few swallows of a golden liquid, the unpredictability of life could be tamed. Not all snake oil was pure deception, at least not in the minds of its makers. Some believed in the power of their concoctions, having inherited recipes from family traditions, or having been convinced by folk remedies that a mix of herbs and spirits truly cured. But others knew full well what they were doing. Bottling alcohol, adding dangerous stimulants, and selling the experience as healing. The most infamous example came from Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment, which gave the entire trade its enduring name. Stanley claimed to have learned the secret of snake oil from Hopi healers, and advertised his liniment as a cure for arthritis, neuralgia, and nearly every ache. When later tested, the liniment contained no snake oil at all, only mineral oil, turpentine, and peppers. The irony was cruel. Real snake oil, used in certain traditional medicines, did contain compounds with mild anti-inflammatory effects. But by the time Stanley's bottles were rolling off the shelves, the very idea of snake oil had become synonymous with fraud. What had once held a grain of truth was drowned in exaggeration and deceit. Still, the demand never faded. Town after town welcomed the wagons because the need was too deep. A mother with a sick child didn't have time for scientific trials. She needed something in her hands. A man whose back ached from work in the fields couldn't wait for years of medical progress. He wanted relief tonight. And so the sales continued, one wagon fading into the dust, another appearing on the horizon. The showmanship of these peddlers lingered long after their wagons had vanished. They laid the foundation for modern advertising, teaching that spectacle sells, that confidence matters as much as content, and that a good story can outweigh doubt. Their words found echoes later in printed ads, posters, and eventually radio jingles. In a strange way, the culture of marketing medicines was born on those dirt roads, in the shadows of wagons painted with promises. But the legacy left scars. Families remembered the bottles that brought no cure, the loved ones who never recovered, the children who slipped away. Some towns grew hostile, chasing away the next wagon that rolled in. Laws eventually began to form, pushing back against the most dangerous frauds. Yet the pattern was set. Where there is suffering, there will always be someone willing to sell hope in a bottle. In the fading light of those evenings, when the wagon pulled away and the last echoes of its band died down, the people who clutched their bottles didn't yet know the truth. They held them close, believing the cure had arrived. And in their quiet homes, they tipped back the liquid, tasting a blend of sweetness and fire, and for a brief, flickering moment, they believed themselves healed. That fleeting comfort, bought from strangers who vanished with the dawn, was what kept the trade alive. And it was what made snake oils, and the miracles they claimed, one of the deadliest illusions ever bottled. In dimly lit chambers of apothecaries and candle glow studies, jars once stood with labels that seemed almost sacred. They did not contain roots, nor herbs, nor oils distilled from fields or forests. They contained dust, dark and fine, the remnants of bodies long entombed. For centuries, men and women across Europe believed that the secret to healing might lie not in plants or minerals, but in the very flesh and bone of the dead. It was a strange idea, and yet to many it seemed natural. If kings and pharaohs had ruled with power that seemed beyond human, then surely their bodies, preserved by ritual and time, carried some of that strength. And so, traders carried mummies out of ancient tombs, breaking open coffins that had slept in silence for thousands of years, crumbling the carefully wrapped figures of Egypt's dead into powders. Those powders travelled far, ground finer and finer, until they could be stirred into wine, sprinkled into broths, or sealed in apothecary jars for patients who came with trembling hands, begging for relief. The trade was not small, nor hidden. By the 16th century, it had become fashionable among the wealthy. Kings themselves swallowed the dust of kings. Physicians prescribed it for bleeding, headaches, or melancholy, claiming that the essence of a preserved body carried a healing power. To eat the flesh of the long dead was not seen as grotesque, but noble, as though one could drink down centuries of dignity and strength with every dose. One of the strangest justifications came from the belief that bitumen, the tarry resin sometimes found in Egyptian wrappings, held medicinal qualities. Apothecaries called it mumia, confusing the material with the mummies themselves. Soon, the word mumia became synonymous with the ground bodies of ancient rulers. If a little tar could heal, then surely the flesh that had endured ages under the desert sun was even stronger. Misunderstanding grew into practice, and practice grew into commerce, until entire caravans were plundering the Valley of the Kings for medicine chests in Paris and London. Those who consumed it believed they were drawing the vitality of the ancients into themselves. For weakness, for epilepsy, for a simple nosebleed, powdered mummy was offered as remedy. Mixed with honey or stirred into wine, it became a tonic swallowed by noblemen, popes, and even emperors. Apothecaries stocked it on their shelves beside mercury and arsenic, selling small packets as if they were as ordinary as herbs. And yet, beneath the polished claims, the trade was brutal. The dead of Egypt, who had been buried with prayers to endure eternity, were dragged from their tombs to serve strangers centuries away. Their carefully bound limbs were cut apart, their skulls smashed, their wrappings discarded in dusty heaps. Children in Cairo grew up watching fragments of ancient royalty sold to merchants like spice. Travellers described shiploads of bodies carried across the Mediterranean, stacked and packed for the markets of Venice, where they were ground, bottled, and exported further still. The irony was that what people consumed was often no mummy at all. Demand quickly outpaced supply. When genuine pharaonic tombs grew scarce, gravediggers turned to fresher corpses. The bodies of criminals, slaves, or the poor were dried in ovens and sold as authentic relics. Some were soaked in bitumen to mimic the smell of ancient resin. And so, those who believed they were drinking the dust of kings were often swallowing the remains of a nameless thief or a beggar. The practice spread beyond the upper classes. Apothecaries offered cheaper versions to ordinary townsfolk, promising vigour, fertility, or relief from pain. In some places, powdered bone was sold alongside remedies made from moss grown on skulls, or fat scraped from executed criminals, each believed to carry curative power. The body, living or dead, was turned into medicine, as though the human form itself could be harvested and repurposed for the suffering of others. But it was not only powders. Strips of mummy flesh were sometimes boiled into broths, drunk as tonics by those who could afford them. Resin scraped from wrappings was mixed into plasters and applied to wounds. Even blood, drawn warm from the bodies of the executed, was taken by patients who believed life itself lingered in the crimson liquid. A young epileptic might stand beneath a gallows, cup in hand, drinking the blood of a man freshly hanged in hopes that the convulsions would vanish. It was a gruesome theatre, yet it passed as medicine, not superstition. Learned men in wigs and robes prescribed it. Europe's fascination with the dead was more than curiosity. It was desperation. Disease was everywhere: plague, fever, consumption, and bleeding gums from scurvy. Doctors had little to offer beyond leeches, bleeding, and prayer. Against such helplessness, the idea that life could be stolen from the dead and transplanted into the living carried a strange logic. If saints' relics healed through faith, why should not the preserved bodies of kings heal through ingestion? Yet the reality was cruel. Mummy powder cured nothing. It could not stop infection, halt plague, or mend broken flesh. At best, it delivered trace minerals. At worst, it carried rot, mould, and poison. Those who consumed it sometimes sickened further, their stomachs twisting from the foul dust. But the belief endured, for when recovery came by chance, it was credited to the powder. And when death followed, it was blamed on the severity of the illness. Hope was stronger than evidence. The trade grew so vast that by the 17th century, entire industries profited from it. Painters mixed powdered mummy into pigments, producing a rich brown known as mummy brown, smeared across canvases in Europe's greatest galleries. The colour carried the same mystique as the medicine, a glamour of antiquity ground into paint. Artists knew what it was, yet used it nonetheless, their brushes dragging across canvas the pulverized remains of forgotten kings. Over time, a quiet unease began to stir. Voices of doubt whispered that to consume the dead was barbaric, that to loot graves for medicine was sacrilege. Yet the fashion persisted, lingering into the 18th century, when supply grew thinner and physicians began to turn toward new sciences. Slowly, chemistry and anatomy chipped away at the old beliefs. Apothecaries began to stock quinine, digitalis, and other remedies tested in laboratories, and the jars of powdered mummy grew dusty on the shelves. By the 19th century, the practice had become a curiosity, a story to be told rather than a medicine to be swallowed. But the echoes of that trade never faded completely. The fascination with life taken from death lingered in subtler forms. Tonic makers still borrowed the language of vitality, promising to restore vigour and extend years. The appetite for miracle cures remained, only the ingredients changed. Instead of powdered kings, bottles now carried coca, morphine, or radium. The pattern endured. Suffering met with desperation. Desperation answered with a substance cloaked in mystery, sold with a promise too large to resist. In the silence of old tombs, deep beneath the sand, the pharaohs had once been wrapped for eternity. Their priests had spoken prayers of protection, their bodies embalmed with care so they might pass into a world beyond. Yet centuries later, their bones were turned to dust and swallowed by strangers who believed they were stealing fragments of immortality. What they consumed was not strength, but illusion. What they bought was not life, but the memory of lives stolen. And so the jars in the apothecary's shop, labelled with fine script, told a darker story than their buyers knew. They were filled not only with the dust of kings, but with the long shadow of human desperation, the endless hunger to hold back death with whatever means the age allowed. A hunger that had turned tombs into markets and reverence into trade. In the twilight of the 19th century and the early hum of the 20th, the world seemed to lean forward with anticipation. The age of gilded bottles and carnival cures was beginning to tarnish, yet the desire for miracle medicines had not dimmed. Factories now rose where once travelling wagons had rolled, their chimneys pumping smoke into skies above growing cities. Laboratories filled with glass flasks, and the hiss of burners promised something new. A world where disease could be conquered, not by superstition or the dust of kings, but by science. For the first time in centuries, there was reason to believe that the deadliest enemies of the human body, pneumonia, blood poisoning, meningitis, might finally be pushed back. And so came sulfur drugs, the bright heralds of modern medicine. Discovered in the 1930s, these compounds seemed to turn back the tide of bacterial disease. A simple pill, swallowed with water, could quiet infections that once killed with certainty. Hospitals that had filled with the rattle of the dying now saw recoveries that felt like resurrection. Mothers who feared the fever that followed a child's scraped knee began to hope again. Physicians for centuries armed with little more than opiates to dull pain and mercury to poison away sickness, finally carried something that worked. It was a moment that felt like dawn breaking after a long and restless night. But dawn can be deceptive, and its light casts long shadows. Sulfur drugs were not gentle. They inflamed the kidneys, burned the skin, and could twist the body with nausea. Some who took them broke out in rashes that spread like wildfire, blistering and peeling, leaving flesh raw. Others collapsed under the strain of toxic reactions. Yet compared to the grip of pneumonia, or the creeping death of sepsis, these dangers seemed small. Families and doctors clung to them, grateful to see any weapon at all against invisible enemies. The triumph of sulphur brought with it a feverish faith in chemistry. If one powder could change so much, surely others would follow. Laboratories churned out tablets and tonics with a speed that seemed unstoppable. Advertisements filled newspapers with bold fonts and illustrations of smiling patients restored to health. Pharmacies lined their shelves with the latest creations, each wrapped in promises of safety and progress. To a world weary of snake oil and powdered bones, these drugs were different. They were modern, tested, bottled in glass stamped with factory marks rather than painted wagons. People trusted them, yet trust has always been the soil in which danger grows fastest. In America during the 1930s, one sulphur preparation would reveal just how fragile that dawn truly was. A company sought to create a sweeter, more appealing version of sulfanilamide, one that could be given to children without complaint. To mask its bitter taste, chemists dissolved it into a syrup flavoured with raspberry, coloured pink to catch the eye. It was sweet, easy to swallow, and sold in handsome bottles under the name Elixir Sulfanilamide. No one asked whether the solvent, diethylene glycol, was safe for human consumption. It was not. It was poison, the same chemical later used in antifreeze. Bottles shipped across the country, and within weeks, children who had been dosed for sore throats and fevers were writhing in agony, their kidneys failing, their bodies unable to cleanse themselves of the toxic brew. More than 100 died, their parents left clutching empty bottles that had carried hope and delivered death. The nation recoiled, horrified that modern medicine, dressed in the trappings of science, could still kill with the cruelty of arsenic or strychnine. It was this tragedy that forced new laws into being. For the first time, governments demanded that medicines be tested for safety before they were sold. Labels had to list ingredients, claims had to be restrained, and manufacturers were held accountable. Yet the Elixir sulfanilamide disaster revealed more than just negligence. It revealed the thin line between progress and catastrophe, a line that humanity continues to walk. While sulphur blazed briefly as the wonder of its day, shadows lengthened, bacteria adapted, learning to resist. Strains that once fell silent began to survive, to spread, to laugh in the face of what had seemed invincible. Physicians who had written sulphur into their prescriptions with near religious zeal began to see failures again. Infections returned, stronger, more stubborn, and in the background, whispers grew of something newer, penicillin, that might take sulphur's crown. Even as the public clung to these early drugs, serums were sweeping through hospitals with their own glow of promise. Derived from the blood of animals or humans, they were touted as life-saving potions. Antitoxins for diphtheria and tetanus, serum therapies for scarlet fever, all were hailed as shields against ancient scourges. Families brought their children into clinics, watching as glass syringes drew liquid from carefully stored vials. Nurses pressed cotton to punctures as the miracle slid into veins. The rituals carried the gravity of progress. White-coated doctors handled the serums with reverence, the liquid shimmering faintly as though it carried life itself. And sometimes it worked. Diphtheria, once a near-certain death sentence for children, loosened its grip when treated with antitoxin. The shadows of epidemics thinned in places where the serum reached. For the first time, it felt as though science was not only chasing disease, but outrunning it. But serums, like sulphur, had their dangers. They were drawn from living bodies, horses often, whose blood was harvested and refined. Impurities slipped through, contamination spread, and patients sometimes suffered violent reactions. Serum sickness, as it came to be called, twisted joints, inflamed the skin, and tormented with fevers. In rare cases, the cure killed as swiftly as the disease. And still, the vials were passed from hand to hand, because they represented the closest thing yet to salvation. This was the false dawn, a period where hope blazed so brightly it blinded many to the risks still present. The public believed that science had finally conquered nature, that humanity had stepped into an age where no plague could strike and no infection could win. Politicians echoed the optimism, industry fanned it into profit, and doctors leaned into it because for the first time they could offer more than comfort, they could offer results. But beneath that brilliance, the old pattern lingered. Medicines could heal, but they could also maim, deceive, and destroy. The difference now was scale. Instead of a wagon in a single town, factories shipped their wares across continents. Instead of one family poisoned by a bottle of arsenic tonic, entire communities could be devastated by a single careless formula. Yet people wanted to believe. They wanted the morning light to be real, even as it flickered. And so they swallowed the tablets, lined up for the injections, and pressed their trust into the hands of those who promised cures. The story of medicine, after all, has never been about certainty. It has always been about longing, the longing to live, to see a child recover, to feel pain lift, to hold death at bay. Sulphur and serums gave that longing shape, wrapped in glass and sealed with cork, and even when the dawn proved false, it still felt warmer than the night that had come before. The world did not stop here. New drugs were waiting just beyond the horizon, glowing with the promise of a truer dawn. But for those who lived in the shadow of sulphur and serums, the memory lingered. Progress and peril bound together, each step forward leaving behind not only survivors, but graves. And so, the shelves of the early 20th century told a familiar story in new language. Bottles stood in neat rows, stamped with factory labels instead of hand-painted slogans, but they carried the same double-edged promise: hope strong enough to heal, and danger sharp enough to kill. Under the dim light of a gas lamp, the world seemed to hum with an uneasy confidence. The air was thick with the rhythm of machines, their metallic groans carrying through brick walls and factory courtyards. Cities, swollen with smoke and ambition, rose higher and spread wider, each street corner offering some token of progress. Each advertisement boasting of new marvels that science had poured into bottles, vials, and neatly stamped paper packets. The age of industry was no longer about soot-stained chimneys alone. It had turned its gaze toward the human body, seeking to standardize health the same way it had standardized cloth, steel, and bread. And so began an era when hope itself could be rolled off assembly lines, pressed into tablets, and labelled with promises that sparkled brighter than truth. There was something almost hypnotic about the rows of new pharmacies and apothecaries that lined the boulevards of Europe and America at the turn of the century. Behind polished glass counters, proud proprietors displayed their products as though they were luxury goods, as essential to life as fine wine or imported tea. Boxes bore names that suggested vigour, vitality, and victory over suffering. Pills for nerves, for fatigue, for blood, for digestion, for the mind itself. Tonics that lifted the spirits, powders that renewed the flesh, capsules that whispered of modernity. Where earlier centuries had leaned on superstition or folk knowledge, this new age had factories that stamped out miracles by the millions. To buy one was not only to seek relief, it was to participate in the forward march of civilization. Inside those factories, men in white coats stood beside rows of whirring machines, their arms moving in rhythm with pistons and belts. The noise was constant, yet there was a strange sense of calm in the repetition. Huge vats of chemical powders were scooped, measured, sifted and blended. What once had been rare or costly could now be multiplied at will. Chalk, Sugar and starch became the foundation of countless formulations, binding together the more mysterious substances that were said to cure. The process had an almost theatrical quality. Coloured dyes were added to give pills a pleasing hue, while coatings made them shine as if polished like gems. It was no accident that they resembled sweets, for the public was far more willing to swallow medicine if it tasted like sugar and gleamed like candy. The manufacturers knew that medicine was not simply swallowed, it was sold, and it was sold best when it carried the sheen of pleasure. This blending of cure and confection marked a turning point, where the patient was not merely a sufferer in need, but a consumer choosing among brands, each promising a slightly different vision of health. And yet, beneath the glossy coatings and bold typefaces, the dangers remained. A single factory might produce pills laced with opium, marketed as gentle sleep aids for children, or tonics steeped in alcohol, disguised as restorative waters for the weary. Some contained quinine in measures far too strong for the heart. Others blended cocaine into nerve tablets that promised clarity of mind at a pace nature could not sustain. The dream of modernity carried with it the familiar shadow that the very substances meant to cure were quietly eroding bodies, fraying nerves, and binding lives to addiction. The story of these medicines cannot be told without the story of their packaging. Boxes were painted with images of strong men carrying hammers, women blooming with rosy cheeks, infants giggling as though no illness could ever touch them. Labels spoke in authoritative tones, invoking science with Latin words that the average buyer could not pronounce, let alone understand. The authority of medicine had shifted. It no longer rested in the wisdom of a local healer, but in the machinery of commerce, in the silent power of factories that could produce not one cure, but thousands each day. The scale itself was intoxicating. Where once a remedy might be mixed in a backroom, now warehouses stocked towering piles of bottles, ready to be shipped by train, carried by wagon, sold in corner shops across entire continents. A woman in Paris and a farmer in Kansas could now swallow the same pill, each believing they had access to the most advanced knowledge the modern age could offer. There was a comfort in that sameness, in knowing that the world was finally shrinking, united not only by steel rails and telegraph wires, but by little white tablets wrapped in paper. The voices that raised caution were quiet, often drowned beneath the roar of progress. Doctors who muttered about overdoses were dismissed as narrow-minded, unwilling to embrace innovation. Some patients, to be sure, questioned why their nerves seemed worse after months of taking a certain powder, or why their child seemed paler and more restless despite the restorative syrup that was given daily. But the advertisements were louder than these murmurs, and the factories kept pace, filling demand with unceasing energy. Even when the harms were clear, they were cloaked beneath language that softened their edges. Addiction was not called addiction. It was described as habit. Weakness was reframed as the need for another dose. If the medicine no longer worked, it was explained as the body's deep-rooted illness demanding a stronger course, never as the poison hidden in the cure itself. Thus, the cycle continued. Pills produced by the thousands, purchased with hope, consumed with trust, leaving behind bodies that trembled, livers that strained, hearts that faltered. The factories of pills and hope thrived not merely because they manufactured medicine, but because they manufactured belief. Belief in the modern, in progress, in the idea that suffering could finally be packaged away. These were not back alley potions, nor dusty jars on a village shelf. They were products of industry, stamped with precision, sealed with authority. To question them was to question the very march of civilization itself. And so, the quiet damage grew alongside the towering stacks of crates ready for shipment. In time, the world would begin to glimpse the truth. There would be lawsuits. There would be exposés. There would be new laws that tried to rein in the worst abuses. But in the heart of the industrial age, in those years when the hum of machines seemed to promise endless progress, the factories kept turning. And for countless men, women, and children, those little pills, bright, sweet, reassuring, became both a source of comfort and a silent chain that bound them more tightly than their illnesses ever had. Factories have always been places where raw material is transformed into something new, ore into steel, grain into bread, cloth into garments. In this case, they turned powder into hope, pressed into tablets, and poured into bottles. Hope could be bought cheaply, swallowed easily, and carried in the pocket. But like so many goods of the industrial age, it was mass-produced at a cost unseen, a cost that weighed not in currency, but in years lost, in bodies broken, in trust misplaced. And so, the era marched on, its streets alive with posters promising remedies, its shop windows lined with glistening cures. Each label carried more than words. It carried the dream of relief, the illusion of safety, and the quiet shadow of risk. Beneath the hum of machines, beneath the endless rows of pills, there lingered a truth that history has not forgotten. That progress, even when wrapped in sugar and stamped in factories, often walked hand in hand with peril. The streets that once glittered with posters promising relief began, with time, to take on a quieter tone. The same walls that bore painted advertisements of rosy-cheeked children and radiant mothers now seemed to echo with whispers of unease. The world had grown accustomed to swallowing promises, each cure arriving in bottles and boxes that gleamed like progress itself, but shadows had lengthened across those polished surfaces. A subtle restlessness stirred among physicians, patients, and lawmakers alike. A realization that the very industry built to banish suffering had left behind its own silent trail of it. The awakening was not sudden. It did not burst forth like revelation. Instead, it crept gently, like fog settling into the cracks of a city street. At first, it was the rare patient who questioned why their tonic had left them weaker than before, or why their beloved child, soothed nightly with a syrup meant to calm, now seemed paler, listless, and slow to rise in the mornings. These questions were not shouted, but murmured in quiet homes, carried between neighbours, passed along in hushed tones in waiting rooms. Doubt, at its beginning, rarely declared itself openly. Doctors, too, long accustomed to trusting the bold claims stamped on glass bottles, began to notice patterns they could not ignore. There were reports of patients whose addictions grew not from vice, but from prescriptions, men and women who found themselves tethered to powders and pills that had been meant only for relief. They saw coughs return, fevers worsen, and nervous disorders grow sharper despite diligent doses of the very medicines advertised to cure them. The explanations offered by manufacturers, that the illnesses were simply too deep-rooted, that stronger doses were needed, that habits were natural, began to ring hollow. The factories, however, did not falter. Machines still pressed their endless tablets, and warehouses still filled with crates of remedies. But outside their doors, journalists began to stir. Newspapers, those same engines of modernity that had once eagerly carried advertisements for miracle syrups, now found stories in the darker corners of the trade. Reporters followed trails of suffering and uncovered what had been carefully hidden. They wrote of patent medicines laced with opium given freely to children, of tonics steeped in alcohol, consumed more for their intoxication than for their curative power, of powders so laden with stimulants that they frayed nerves to shreds. It was not a storm that toppled the certainty of medicine's golden promises. It was a drizzle of stories, accumulating gathering, each one adding weight, until the edifice of unquestioning faith began to lean. What had once been dismissed as rumour grew harder to deny when families came forward in greater number, their losses bearing the same patterns, their griefs echoing one another. Governments, ever cautious, moved slowly. The idea of regulating medicines seemed almost an affront to the spirit of progress, as though mistrust itself might halt the machinery of advancement. Yet pressure mounted. Physicians called for standards, journalists for accountability, and grieving parents for justice. The first small measures were hesitant, requirements that bottles carry labels of contents, suggestions that harmful substances be declared openly. Even then, manufacturers found ways to soften the blow, hiding dangerous truths behind vague words or omitting them altogether. Still, the current had shifted. Where once the public embraced every pill as a token of the modern age, now a sliver of doubt accompanied the swallow. Conversations grew in the parlours of cities and the kitchens of farmhouses alike. Was this tonic truly a cure, or just another clever promise? Could science, so proud in its discoveries, also err? Yet it is important to remember how deeply the dream of medicine had embedded itself into daily life. These were not distant miracles. These were bottles kept in cupboards, tonics poured at the bedside, syrups spooned to restless children in the night. To doubt them was to doubt the rhythm of domestic life itself. And so the awakening of skepticism was not triumphant, not sudden, but slow, hesitant, and often painful. Families found themselves torn between loyalty to what they had always trusted and the gnawing suspicion that their trust had been misplaced. The awakening also revealed the complexity of medicine's double edge. For even among the deadliest cures, there were moments of relief, however fleeting. Morphine dulled unbearable pain. Cocaine sharpened exhausted minds, if only for a moment. Alcohol-based tonics lent warmth in the coldest hours. To awaken to their dangers was to face a truth more complex than simple betrayal. These medicines had given something even as they took away. They had soothed in the short term, even as they sowed long-term harm. This complexity made the doubt heavier. For patients and doctors alike, it was easier to trust in illusions of certainty than to face the tangled truth that progress was imperfect, that science could fail, that industry could deceive. And so the awakening was not only about medicines, it was about the limits of trust, the fragility of hope, and the cost of believing too readily in easy answers. The voices of reform grew louder as the new century deepened. Organisations formed, demanding testing, demanding oversight, demanding that the public no longer be left blind to what they consumed. The battle was not only against poison in bottles, but against the machinery of commerce that profited from hope more than from healing. Some manufacturers resisted fiercely, hiring lawyers, producing their own pamphlets to dismiss concerns, branding their critics as fearmongers. Others saw opportunity in change, rebranding themselves as trustworthy under the new rules, eager to sell not only medicine, but the image of responsibility. As these struggles unfolded, the public found itself caught in between. The pills and tonics still on their shelves, the advertisements still colourful and convincing, but the whisper of caution now more difficult to ignore. Each swallow carried with it a question that had not been present before. What exactly was hidden within this cure, and at what cost would relief come? The slow awakening of doubt did not end the age of deadly medicines. Factories still hummed, promises still glittered, and patients still reached for bottles in moments of need. But it did plant seeds of skepticism that would, over time, grow into movements that reshaped medicine itself. The demand for standards, for truth in labelling, for accountability in production, would eventually transform how medicines were made, sold, and trusted. Yet in those early years, when the fog of trust had only just begun to lift, the awakening was fragile, tentative, and far from complete. History records this awakening not as a triumph, but as a gradual stirring, like eyes opening reluctantly after a long and troubled sleep. It was not dramatic, but necessary, not swift, but enduring. For it is in doubt, quietly sown and slowly spread, that the world began to shift from swallowing promises without question to demanding a truth that could stand the weight of scrutiny. And in that slow, uneasy transformation, one sees the shape of progress more clearly, not as a straight path of discoveries, but as a winding road where illusions must be shed, dangers confronted, and trust rebuilt piece by fragile piece. Beneath the hum of modern cities, beyond the neon signs and the endless shelves of pharmacies, there lingers an inheritance invisible to the eye, yet deeply etched into the fabric of human life. It is the residue of centuries in which bottles glistened with false hope, powders shimmered with peril, and syrups carried sweetness laced with harm. Though the world today prides itself on clinical trials, sterile laboratories, and regulations written into law, the veins of history still carry faint traces of the medicines that once promised life, and instead scattered death in quiet, merciless ways. The legacy is not a neat story with a clear beginning and end. It is more like a slow current winding through generations, a current made of memories, scars, and the quiet reshaping of trust. Families who once handed down recipes for household remedies now handed down caution. Entire nations, once intoxicated by the spectacle of miracle cures, learned to look more carefully, though not always deeply enough. The bottles that had stood proudly in kitchen cupboards gave way to labelled vials, but the shadow of deception, once permitted so freely, remained like an echo at the edge of progress. It is strange to imagine how much of our present world still pulses with that inheritance. Consider how medicine today is built upon a foundation laid by centuries of error. The regulations that demand safety, the labels that reveal ingredients, the cautious trials that precede approval. All these safeguards exist only because the world had once been without them. In that absence, lives had been spent recklessly, and only through loss did laws grow teeth. The legacy of those deadliest cures was not only measured in the bodies they claimed, but in the systems constructed to prevent their return. Progress, in its truest sense, was purchased with grief. Yet the legacy goes deeper than legislation. It persists in culture itself. For even in the age of reason and science, whispers of miracle cures still find eager ears. The colourful advertisements of the past have transformed into glossy commercials. The street hawkers of snake oil replaced by polished voices on screens. Though the language has grown more sophisticated, the promise remains the same: relief, restoration, transformation, and sometimes salvation. One can still see, in the persistence of fad diets, wonder drugs, and supplements with extravagant claims, the same hunger that once filled apothecary shops and patent medicine stalls. The human desire for easy cures has not withered. It has simply changed costume. The veins of history also carry more intimate marks. Addiction, born in the era of freely prescribed laudanum and morphine, still courses through societies. Generations once ensnared by the velvet chains of morphine, or soothed by the syrupy grasp of opiates, unknowingly laid groundwork for struggles that echo into the present day. What had begun as bottled remedies for pain and sleeplessness grew into epidemics that shaped laws, reshaped communities, and left behind lingering battles still fought in hospitals, homes, and courtrooms. To trace these roots is to see how the choices of chemists and merchants long dead still shape the suffering of the living. The legacy is also visible in the paradoxical trust the public places in science. On one hand, skepticism grew from bitter lessons, the realization that gleaming advertisements could lie, that trusted bottles could poison, that promises could be empty. On the other hand, the sheer relief brought by genuine breakthroughs, antibiotics that banished infection, vaccines that stilled plagues, rekindled faith in medicine as a force of salvation. These twin impulses, suspicion and reverence, continue to weave through public life. Each new discovery is met with hope, shadowed by wariness. Every pill swallowed with both trust and hesitation. One must also remember that the legacy is not only Western. Across continents, in villages and cities, the story of deadly medicines played out differently, but no less profoundly. In some places, imported tonics and powders carried harm across oceans, their labels unreadable to those who consumed them. In others, local remedies blended with imported substances, creating mixtures whose risks were scarcely understood. The veins of history run globally, their lines crossing borders as easily as trade ships once did. To speak of legacy is to speak of humanity's shared vulnerability, its common yearning, and its repeated willingness to risk much in the hope of relief. What remains most haunting is the realization that the legacy is not confined to the past. Even now, medicines with dangers tucked quietly into their chemistry pass through the hands of patients. Even now, industries weigh profit against caution. And even now, governments struggle to keep pace with innovation. History's lesson lies not in claiming the dangers have been conquered, but in recognizing how persistent the cycle can be. The names of the substances may change, the methods of distribution may evolve, but the rhythm, the dance between hope, harm, and hard-earned wisdom remains. The image of veins is fitting, for just as blood carries both nourishment and vulnerability, history too delivers both progress and peril. The same system that circulates healing can also deliver harm if the substance within is tainted. The legacy left in our veins is not simply chemical, but symbolic. It is the recognition that medicine is never free from risk, that every cure carries shadows, that every promise must be weighed against the lessons carved into the bodies of those who came before. And so, as night deepens and the tale of deadly medicines stretches toward its quiet conclusion, one cannot help but hear the soft rhythm of continuity. The bottles may have changed, the labels may now shine with clinical authority rather than carnival-like flair, yet the story persists in the undercurrent of caution. To study the past is to feel its pulse still within us, faint yet insistent, reminding us that every swallow is an act of trust, every prescription an echo of decisions made in centuries past. The legacy, then, is not one of despair, but of fragile awareness. It asks us to look more closely at the things we welcome into our bodies, to question with care, to remember that progress has always been written in both triumph and tragedy. To fall asleep with such a story is not to be burdened, but to drift gently into the realization that history is not distant, it moves quietly within us, flowing in currents as steady as the blood beneath our skin. And as silence settles, the bottles of yesterday, shimmering with poison wrapped in promise, rest on the shelves of memory. Their glass may be clouded now, their labels faded, their powders turned to dust. Yet their influence endures, not in the cabinets of our kitchens, but in the quiet skepticism of our minds, in the cautious trust of our hands, and in the unseen legacy that hums softly ceaselessly through our veins. And so as we let the story settle, we find ourselves looking back at what we've just wandered through together. We've stepped into dimly lit apothecaries where bottles glowed with promise, only to reveal their hidden poisons. We've walked beside desperate families, clutching vials of laudanum, powders of arsenic, and the gleam of mercury, believing these would heal them. We've watched as factories rose with the machinery of hope, stamping pills by the thousands, sending serums into the veins of the sick, and filling cupboards with cures that so often carried consequences unseen. It has been a journey through centuries of trial and error, through faith and doubt, through the stubborn human need to believe that relief could be found in glass and powder. And along the way, we've seen how thin the line can be between a medicine and a poison, how the same hands that offered comfort also, unknowingly, delivered suffering. These medicines were born from hope, yet so many left legacies of pain. As history unfolds, it whispers the same warning again and again, that progress is never clean, and healing is rarely without risk. What we face in these stories is not only the danger of the past, but the reflection of ourselves, our willingness to trust, our hunger for certainty, our desperate wish to cure what ails us, even when the cure may carry its own shadow. And as you drift into the quiet of night, let this story linger softly, an echo of glass bottles in candlelight, of powders ground into dust, of voices promising relief that time would prove far more dangerous than anyone knew. Before you go, take a second to subscribe to this channel. It may seem like a small thing, but it keeps these stories alive and helps them reach others who find comfort in these long, winding histories. And in the comments, share your thoughts. What struck you most about the medicines we spoke of tonight? Was it the powdered bones of kings, the shimmering promises of mercury, or the factories that churned out pills like little tokens of false hope? Your words, your presence here, they are part of this strange, sleepless community we've built. Tiny voices scattered across the world, coming together to remember the stories history has tried to let slip away. So until we meet again in the next midnight tale, let the noise of the day fall away. Let your thoughts slow like the turning of an old hourglass. And let yourself drift, knowing that even the darkest chapters of history can become quiet company in the night.